And g'day, and welcome to Pints with Aquinas. Today I have Dr. Matthew Meinard on the show. We're going to be discussing all of your questions concerning morality and who knows what else. We'll see what happens. A couple of things I want to say before we get going. Next week is Lent, or the Great Fast, depending on whose side you're on. And I've got two things I want to tell you about. I have put together a beautiful PDF of Thomas Aquinas' daily meditations for Lent. This is not something that I excerpt from his works and threw together. This is something he actually wrote. It does sound like a Matthew Kelly thing, like, a day, but it's actually Thomas Aquinas. So it's free. So click the top link in the description below and you can get that ebook and read those daily meditations throughout the Great Fast until Easter. And they're about a page each. So they're definitely doable. And so if you're still looking for something to do for Lent, I'm just going to go back and forth, Great Fast, Lent. Click that link, download it. And as I say, it's completely free. So that's there for you guys. Now, second thing I want to do is say thank you to Exodus 90. Over 1 billion people all over the world will start living different in some way. At least that's the hope, maybe giving up alcohol or chocolate or whatever. For a lot of Catholics, Lent is a time of finding the easiest way to give something up. But at the end of those 40 days, does the sacrifice really make a difference? I hate when people do that to me, actually. It's the ad read, I know, but like when people guilt me. Oh, you're giving up candy? What are you? I'm like, well, candy's hard, so how about shut up? This year, there's another opportunity out there specifically for men that will actually help you grow closer to God. Now, you've heard of Exodus 90. We've been talking about them for a while now, and many of you probably joined in January leading you up to Easter. But let me tell you about Exodus Lent. It's a 40-day journey that will challenge you to dig a little deeper this year. So if you were trying to start Exodus 90 in January and didn't, you can still do this. Now, if your first reaction is, I'm absolutely not taking cold showers, well, you're in luck. Men who take Exodus Lent get to take warm showers, drink alcohol, and when you're with others, watch TV and sports. But don't be fooled. This will be a very challenging 40 days. So if you're looking for something to do, actually, I'll give you a different link here. It's exoduslent.com/Matt. exoduslent.com/Matt. Check that out and join a bunch of other men around the world who'll be doing Exodus Lent. That's exoduslent.com/Matt. Dr. Matthew Meinard.
Good to be here. I'm watching. I don't want to turn. I have to sit
you
in
have
my
to
spot.
Sit very still.
I've chosen my spot.
I have a little button that will electrocute you from the chair that you thought was a normal
I've
chair.
got strong legs. I'm a runner and a skier, so I'll stand up,
It's nice to have you on the show.
Good to be on. Good to be on.
Yeah. The first time I heard about you were on Reason Theology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you had a bow tie, which I thought was cool.
Yeah, and I do still. And, sometimes the Ascension people tell me wear the bow tie because people think that's, it makes you look professorial. But, there's a risk. Yes, but there's the risk that I sound like a professor. So I said, let's at least have like the...
It's a nice tie.
Yeah, have just a tie with the little flowers on it. So
Very good. Well, this is the first time we've met, and it's a real honor to meet you.
Yeah, it's been really enjoyable up to this point, too, all the bantering that happens before the show.
It's amazing. You put out a book recently on Catholic morality. Is that the latest book? Excuse me, latest book you put out? Or?
Well, it's the latest book in my name. I do a good bit of translating, and I've got a number of things that are just on the edge of all coming out right now.
Yeah.
So there's a book on conscience that Clooney Press has done, but it's very technical stuff. So this is in a different register, very popular text.
And what's the book called again?
Made by God, Made for God.
Made by God,
which you can go to
made
ascensionpress.com/Catholic morality.
They're going to be very happy.
I remember it. I know I have to get two times, and they told me months ago. Always remember 2 times.
All right.
So, but
very good. So what do you teach? What's your degree in?
Yeah, so my degree is actually in philosophy. Primarily teach philosophy, but I also teach moral theology for the Ruthenian Byzantines and the Melkites.
Now, is he already too far to the right?
No, he's good.
No, you're good.
You see, I'm good.
All right.
Yeah,
I'll shut up. You go.
I listened to your guy. No, it's fine.
So you teach, sorry.
So it's fine. So I teach for the Ruthenians and Melkites at St. Cyril and Methodius Byzantine Seminary. I actually teach at your alma mater too, of course, at Holy Apostles. Yeah. So a friend of mine, Dr. John Kerwin, used to teach, and he was finishing. I said, Dad, do you want to take these? And I said, that's nice. I can teach a bit of Thomism over there while not doing that so much with the Byzantines.
They wouldn't want you to do that? Even a little bit?
A little bit, but you have to always convince them because they think you're Latinizing them. You're not being sufficiently Eastern and whatnot. Fair. So, I teach our moral theology course sequence. I should do some history of Catholicism, so 20th century stuff on Vatican II and whatnot, and then our philosophy. We don't have a huge philosophy program in the East for our seminarians. We sort of have permission not to do that because our code of canon law doesn't say it. But so I do that as well.
So when did you switch from being a Roman Catholic to the Ruthenian Church?
Yeah, my paperwork was, I have to actually think here. It's like, the COVID year ruins everything, right? You sort of forget which year is which. So it's either 2018 or 2019 that my paperwork went through. But when I was dating my wife, my then fiance, I had moved back while I was in graduate school from Washington, D.C. to the hills of Western Pennsylvania. Was working on a house. It was my grandparents' house that we moved into. And it needed a bit of work. And I'm living there before we got married. And was lazy, to be honest, at first. She and I would normally go over town, it was a couple towns over for me, actually, an hour or so, to the traditional Latin Mass. And I always felt that was always a world I was in which I was just safe from liturgical excess and abuse. Never quite felt spiritually at home, but I had lived for 3 years in simple profession as a Benedictine, so liturgical spirituality has always been sort of at the core of my spirituality. So the TLM was at home, but it was snowing. I had a little tiny Nissan Versa because I was a graduate student. I managed to make it off the mountain, and I thought, I'm just going to go to that Byzantine church I know that's in town. I don't know if you've had this experience, or I don't know if your viewers have had this experience. You can run into a very anti-Latin, anti-Western vibe in the Byzantine Catholic world, right? It feels like you're walking into an Orthodox world, right? And there's a real sense in which we Eastern Catholics really want to someday be Orthodox in union with Rome, but that's not the state of affairs right now. So that anti-Latinism I ran into during a period of my life when I lived out on the West Coast. And there was a very devout and nice Russian Catholic priest, but he also made a couple of just rather snarky, I would use much stronger language,
there's a lot
remarks
of that.
To me. Because I was wearing red on Pentecost, not knowing my color scheme. It should have been green, blah, blah, blah. And he said something in his homily, and I made a remark to him jokingly afterwards. And his remark was like, I knew that I was making that for you because you came looking like a Latin. And I'd heard of this attitude, and it just left a terrible taste in my mouth. I was
at a Byzantine Ruthenian Church recently, and I was gathering for donuts with everybody else, and there's a little gift store there, and there was a Chotki, and it had a bead after every 10 knots. And I said, that's cool, because you could pray the Rosary on that as well. We don't pray the Rosary. It's like, why do you have to be that defensive?
I know.
Why not just acknowledge that the Rosary is a beautiful devotion that you could pray if you wanted to?
Yeah, that you can meditate on the life of Christ and you don't have to lose yourself.
After saying that, I think I completely understand. When you are the small guy, you have to vigorously defend yourself against the encroachment of the Western Church.
Which has happened many a times over. And I didn't live through that since I switched ritual churches, so it's just harder for me to affectively get there, but it's exactly what it is. Is whenever you're going to be swamped by the Latin Church, really throughout the whole universal church.
It's like the Quebecois in Canada. You have to be violently in for French.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So anyway, that experience plus, and we didn't get to this when we were talking a little bit earlier. I went to a low liturgy a number of times. Have you ever experienced that oddity? Not low Latin Mass. I'm talking about low divine liturgy.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Without any epistle, with just a gospel. So
is this usually not a daily divine liturgy?
This is not what they should be like. So but it's interesting. We can circle back there, but your poor viewers are like, they've just gone into the esoterica of a church that I've never even heard of.
Okay.
Ruthenians.
This is not about them. It's about us.
That's it. This is just us. We just want to talk. Welcome for the ride. It's really quite improper. I mean, we used to have a form like this, though, that was akin to what the Roman Church has in the old form. It was effectively a private mass, but with communion, with preaching, maybe. But this was on Sundays being done at a parish just on the other side of where I had grown up. And so sometimes when certain relatives would be in town and I'd be trapped in my old hometown, I didn't want to go to the Roman Church there because it was always quite goofy, actually. I'd go there and I thought, this is strange, but I didn't know any better. And then after becoming Ruthenian, I realized this priest had been doing it forever that way and just never changed when the books changed.
Right.
So when he died, that poor parish had to get introduced to...
How long was the low divine liturgy?
40 minutes. It was 40 minutes on the circumcision of the Lord because we don't celebrate... we celebrate the Synaxis of Our Lady the day after Christmas, whereas the West celebrates that at the beginning of the year, right? Mary Mother of God is the Western,
January, right?
Yeah. So we celebrate the circumcision like the West used to. So it's a significant feast day among the mysteries, and it was just a 40-minute liturgy. And I took some relatives who were visiting my folks to it, and they never had gone, and I can't even explain to them what just happened. I just said, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I should have just let you go to a Latin church, So these experiences pretty strongly, in two different ways, disposed me against it. This snarky anti-Latinism and what in the world was this of may he rest in peace, like eternal memory, Father Salco, or whatever his name was. So I go down to the church in Uniontown, which, we could even call it Uniate Town. Nice. It's the home of where we Easterners came to here from Ukraine and Transcarpathia. And I almost immediately at that first liturgy felt right at home in a way I never did. I have a PhD. We tend to live in our heads, right? Mm-hmm. It was that experience of my heart just immediately melted. I grew up in a rather Slavic background, as I shared with you, because my mother spent an immense amount of time with her grandmother. So all of that, coal patch town life of the hunkies, my mother just adored it. And so tried to keep at least the cultural practices down through our household's life. But I was Roman Catholic. But we went to a Slovak Roman Catholic parish growing up. And I think that some of the Slavic elements that are in the Ruthenian liturgy, which will be like that in the Ukrainians too, right? Because it's going to be different from church to church. Go to a Melkite church, and it's going to feel like you're among the Arabs, because that's their liturgy. Whatever Greek influences from Constantinople are extra for them that the Slavs don't have. It's Arab, right? The tones sound Arabic, etc. And I just said, that part of my soul, boy, talk about being too lighthearted. That part of my soul that when I was a 5-year-old kid that never did artwork whatsoever, but then went with his parents to see Fiddler on the Roof, which is just a bunch of Ukrainian tones that, set for, a Jewish story though, that loved it. It was the only artwork I ever did, was tried to make this cutout fiddle. And it was for years, it was the only artwork on the wall that my mother had, if I may. I always said that there's something in that Ukrainian music that, is from birth has been in my soul. But spiritually, it felt at home. I had a priest who I didn't realize till after he died even how just authentically Eastern he was. I knew we really ran the liturgical schedule, as you should, in an Eastern parish, with as many of the special liturgies as possible throughout the different seasons. But then I talked to our rector at the seminary recently, and he looked at me and said, "That's very strange for parish use." But Father Ron, on the other hand, too, just did not one iota care about the Latin problem. He was so at home. He'd get so mad at the anti-rosary stuff. We weren't saying it before liturgy, which, truth be told, fine, parishes in the Roman Church do it. There's a sense in which you shouldn't do it there. It's a shame. Why can't you do one of the little hours or something? But I love the liturgy of the hours. But I'm an ex-monk, so maybe I don't understand that. But he was very much at home with the breviary in the West. There'd be feast days. He would just pull out his Western breviary because he'd usually read the Office of readings. Even though he would do his Horologian. It's just he lived a very monastic life. He was a kind of John Vianney for the little poor hunkies in Uniontown, really. I think he was a saint, really. So I was at home. I felt at home and comfortable, sort of at least exploring. But I, started going pretty regularly. And after we got married, we drifted into going more and more.
What about your wife?
So that's a good segue to get there. So
because when the first time we experienced the Byzantine liturgy, I felt like you did at home, but my wife felt that even more so. Because up until this point, I was dragging her to the Latin Mass.
Yeah.
And her experiencing the Latin Mass is like trying to convince someone that this is an objectively beautiful piece of art, but they just can't see it.
Yeah.
They can appreciate it for what it is, but they're just like, yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah. It's like someone who looks at the Dutch masters with all the realism. They're like, it's great, but we have pictures now. They can see the art.
Exactly.
Not that.
Not
exactly.
We were just in Sarasota this weekend, and we went to the Latin Mass, and it was the same thing. She's like, I can't. I feel bad that I can't, but I can't. But when we walked into that Byzantine church, she was just very much at home.
Yeah, and so my wife is much more spiritually at home in the West. She also, though, all throughout her graduate school experience, just went to every liturgy under the sun, be it Latin, Western, whether or not she'd joke, whether or not she was looking for a husband at the time, but then she'd even go to Coptic Orthodox liturgies.
Yeah.
She said, I'm the only, and she's Irish and Northern Italian is what she comes from. So she's just this really white person among a bunch of Copts, But she was much more comfortable in the East. I'll admit quite humbly. I'll even tell the story. We're passing by a church in Greensburg. This is before these experiences. And she and I are both in the car, and she crosses herself Byzantine. And I'm still quite Roman at the time. And I crossed myself Western. And I said to her, I went like this with I said, West is best. And God has humbled me. I used to think the East is a bunch of woolly-haired people who have a chip on their shoulder. This is what I thought.
What does woolly-haired mean?
Oh, think of a West or an Eastern monk, sort of the long hair, right? Okay. Let it not be pulled back. It's woolly-haired, sure. Yeah. So she's always been comfortable there, quite comfortable there, but she's still canonically Raman.
Yeah.
It's her home. She sometimes by herself and sometimes with me will go to the traditional Latin Mass, on a Saturday or something.
She prefers that?
She does. She prefers it, but she doesn't begrudge going to the Ruthenian
Is this
liturgy.
a strange point in sort of Catholic history where we are exposed to a multitude of different liturgies? Yeah. I grew up in just like a regular Novus Ordo. I didn't know that there was anything else, including the Latin Mass.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, it's this or nothing. What has it done to our spiritual lives now that we have a sort of cornucopia of options? Is this good?
I think it's good. I think it's rich if you don't become a dilettante, but I think it is good because I think it heals some of the experience of groups that have never seen each other. They can experience each other. But you also grew up in a very Western place. Welcome to Rust Belt America, where you are now. I mean, that's just, it's unique. If you look at the Byzantine maps, I have an idea for gender reveal pierogies that my cousin and I want to do. And I said, between Passaic, New Jersey and Toledo, Ohio, we're golden, we're millionaires, right? Because that's Byzantine country, right? Yeah. So that's some of that as well.
Right.
But we are, especially because of the stuff with the traditional Latin Mass, that's opened up all these other liturgical conversations that really didn't exist because
and not just that, it's the internet that's allowed them to like, who the heck is interested in having a conversation about Byzantine and Latin Mass? And like, when would EW10 invite you on before the time of YouTube to give you a 10-minute or 3-minute soundbite about the glories of Byzantium?
Yeah. So that's sort of my story. And I mean, I just sort of muddled along, and slowly but surely, one of the cantors sort of kept saying to me, "Come over and cantor. I can hear you." And I said, "No." I said, "I'm just a Westerner." And then when I met him, he sounded like the trads I knew in some ways, because he was so worked up about the new liturgical books, which are in many ways mild. If you've gone through the I don't want to say cataclysmic, the large changes of the West. Thank you. Yep. Cataclysmic changes that happened within the Western liturgy. You should say, sit down, and just translations
have a
too.
Drink.
Yeah,
calm down.
It's like go throw back some Slivovitz, right? Have some plum brandy that the Slavs have. But very, very good guy, and it took his big temperament to sort of pull me in, and probably that filled some part of my soul that needs that as an ex-religious. Just to have a certain ministry.
Now, when you went east, did you find that you had to make a conscious choice to invest in the spiritual life of the East, even in your private devotions, even to the point of choosing to move away from Western devotions?
It wasn't very hard. It was a matter of changing one set of liturgy of the hours, and guess what? Lectio Divina works both East and West.
So you weren't praying the Rosary and things like this? I am bread
and butter, and I always have been. As a kid even, with little pious kid. My family was not very observant, but as I because of someone I dated in high school, became more and more Catholic, I still never felt at home with the Rosary. I mean, it's a very beautiful devotion for meditating on the mysteries of Christ's life. We should always have the sacred humanity of Christ before our mind's eye. So I don't, I'm not at all saying anything negative there, but it was never affectively mine. And I still remember my first experience of the Liturgy of the Hours. I was just bowled away. I thought, what's this? And it's in a sense that's always been like the central pillar of my devotional life. Right. I miss in some ways, Liturgy of the Hours, talk about something that was bombed in the West, because it really got pared down in the liturgical changes. People don't talk about that one a lot. But there's a way in which the current breviary is a good layman's devotion, because it's so brief in the West. I miss some of the sequence there. I spent so many years with the Grail Psalter for all of its problems. That's the thing that even if I sometimes go back and am at a Western monastery, I can almost rattle that stuff off from my years as a monk. So I miss that. The sequencing is very repetitive. Very often I'm doing something out of the publican prayer book that the Melkites do, and it's you're stuck on the same psalm sequence like every day. But nonetheless, it was fine. That doesn't really deeply bother me. So it just was not an issue.
So you're in this interesting point though, where you are teaching at a Catholic Eastern seminary as well as a Western Catholic seminary and college. And so you have a great love for the East, and you also have a great love for Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah.
Can you help me understand why the Orthodox are so averse to Thomas Aquinas and the Scholastics?
Yeah, I have to be careful here because I will go out into the technicalities. I think it's two things. There's a fundamentally different idea of what theology is. The West thinks the West tends to use the word theology to refer to something like theological science, notional theology, reflective theology, in a sense, something like scholastic theology. Not necessarily scholasticism, but this kind of academic theology. And that's due to a whole host of things that happened in the 13th century onward, from the time of Aquinas onward. Everything that happens with the reception of Aristotle very much is it's such a huge sea change from a monastic idea of theology is just meditation on scripture and preaching thereupon to this scholastic model, which is this academic model is just something that you don't have the same echo. You don't have the same echo in the East. It's there, right? Of course, you can look at systematic texts like something on the Orthodox faith by John of Damascus. You can't read St. Gregory Palamas without realizing the kind of significant Byzantine quasi-scholastic stuff going on there. But even so, the coin of the realm is mystical theology in that ancient sense of mystical theology, mysticism, ultimately something that caps out in prayer and the liturgy. And the East never had the same
it's interesting.
cultural development.
If I was to sum it up in a soundbite, would you say...
Thank you.
And you don't have to. I'm just, for my sake, would you say that in the East, you could say a theologian is one who prays? And in the West, if you were to say, what is theology, you would say somebody who studies. Yeah. Like that's what the emphasis would be on the study, not the prayer. Even if that's on an unfair sort of
That's
dumbing down.
At the cultural level, right? That's very much taken in. That Evagrian line from Evagrius, desert monk, about the theologian as one who prays. It's funny because St. Gregory Palamas does distinguish that kind of theology from a kind of scholastic-y kind of theology, right? A reflective theology. He does do it. But it never is institutionalized, that second one. The theologian is he who prays is really, in the end, still the sense of what it means to be a theologian. And I think that's a cultural thing, that you don't have the same university culture. The West becomes so wealthy and developed and urban that kind of scholastic thing can like endure. It's huge. Like the edifice of, if you ever read like the later scholastics, it's so blasted technical that like, this can only exist in a really high level society.
Gotcha.
So the other side is to you're gonna get me in trouble. I have to think of it. There is, and Marcus Plested, who's an Orthodox author, says the same thing. There's a kind of insecurity sometimes, I think, that you're going to lose. You're going to get swallowed up by talking in a Western way, right? So you have to push against Aquinas totally, or against scholasticism totally, because, otherwise you're just going to do theology like those Westerners. And I feel comfortable saying that only because an Orthodox author himself, who's done like Orthodox readings of Aquinas, is one of the texts Plested has written. And he really is imploring his Orthodox brethren to have the steel spine to say, I can do this and not lose my identity, right? That's a mark of being mature, is that, you're not echoing everything that you're around. You learn to take in your environment, to respond to things, to talk to people, to debate, and maintain your identity the whole time and not collapse. So it's like both of those. It's like we have to assert that we're not Western or not scholastic. But a priest that we both know rather well said to me once, he said, I'm going to be preaching to some Ruthenians. And he said, I have no sense of what the spirituality is, except everyone keeps telling me it's not Western. It's like, it's
sort of like Canadians who say we're not American. That's their identity.
It's not going to take you very far. I mean, I guess it'll help you sleep at night, but I don't mean that as negative, right? I mean, it's a real fear to have, that you can scholasticize your theology. And I appreciate this more and more with my time in the East.
What does it mean to scholasticize one's theology in a way that's negative?
Oh, in a way it's negative. I'm sure you're aware of this kind of genre where everything becomes a kind of repetition and hyper commentary, or I'm just commenting on that which is in Aquinas. And that's really that's the most tempting thing, because he's the big man in the room. Like, you can guess what someone's going to say, right? Like, the risk with my book, which someday we'll talk about, I'm not blaming you. I'm thinking Ascension Press is going to say, wow, he talked about lots of Byzantine things this whole time. But I knew I had to rein myself in from basically having the moral part of the Summa open and just sort of redoing it. Yeah. There are so many books that just do that, right?
Yeah.
And you want to have a different way of incorporating the mysteries about our divine vocation, our Christification through grace, without just sounding like you're saying, okay, I'm doing beatitude. Now I'm talking about human acts. Talk about the passions next, because they are, the next subordinate principle of human acts, right? This is what I'm doing, is tracing the prima secundae of the Summa Theologiae. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to only do that, this kind of hyper commentary, which is a real temptation. Have you ever read Columba Marmion?
No.
Oh, it's quite well worth, and as an Easterner, you might like it. I probably wasn't ready for Dom Marmion when I was a monk, actually, but I'm reading his Christ and his Mysteries. As a Thomist, I see behind the scenes what he's doing, and in some of his works, he does cite the stuff out of Thomas he has in mind, but it's really all just a mystery. It's all a reflection on the mysteries of Christ's life as really our own mysteries, because all of our grace flows from his grace as head of the church. Christ's what they call capital grace, and it's done in a way that doesn't feel like I'm just working out I'm regurgitating a kind of Thomist line, right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of what I'm getting at. And there are lots of other doctors and lots of other approaches, and there's an entirely different liturgical year for just considering the mysteries, right? So if you're reflecting on the mysteries of Christ's life, you're just going to do it in a different way than St. Thomas does, because you're living in a different liturgical context. Yeah.
So the East's pushback on Aquinas and scholasticism isn't, let's not think carefully about these things from an intellectual perspective, right? Because as soon as I ask a question, you have to answer me. If you are to answer me intelligibly, you're going to have to be thinking and using logic and appealing to revelation.
And the best and real Orthodox theologians will totally agree with that. Yeah. So.
Okay, so when again, I'm still trying to understand the pushback against Aquinas or against scholasticism at whole. Like, what's the problem? What's the problem? Is it that he gets too far into the weeds? Is it that he's trying to explicate that which can only be revealed as mystery and can't be understood a great degree?
This is funny to me. I don't know, because I've read these later scholastics that come afterwards. That's all weeds. The guys who are writing, in the generations after Aquinas, and some of whom from my great devotion and love, Thomas de Vio-Cajetan, my first daughter is named after him. John of St. Thomas, Sylvester of Pieris, all these people. That's the weeds of okay, we can split this hair 16 times over to make distinctions. Yes. So then you go back to Aquinas and you're like, it's just this, it actually is this beautiful, I find it clear.
Yep.
It's backs itself on Scripture and the Fathers. It doesn't try to actually push too much into the details. That drives the technical theologian mad, right? But I think it is a fear of getting lost in kind of scholastic precision, imagining that kind of thing is the whole of theology. I guess that happens too. I really want to be careful. It's easy to just say, oh, that does happen, right? Because then you can kind of just throw some people overboard and say, oh, so the Orthodox are right to see that. That's very unfair. Who lives their spiritual life like that? I mean, we all know people who think the answer's in the book, because it's an easy temptation. The Catholics do this, right? Catholics are like, I've got a problem in my life, and well, here's a book that will help you. It's like, well, no, it's really the prayer practices of the church are what will help you. But it's a pretty rare person who says that.
Says
right?
What?
Who
the
says,
second thing?
The book. No, the book.
No, I would say most
people
would say the book is the answer.
Oh,
that's been my experience.
Do you see me? I'm trying to, from the East, to be as positive as I can be, to not do one of these anti-Western tropes.
Yeah, no, but it is that. That's been my experience.
That is what they're afraid of.
But they would say that the book will lead you into a different way of living. I mean, but maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe it's like the book will lead you into a different way of thinking.
That's what. It bugs the Orthodox soul, because the Orthodox soul is still closer to what the West was like when it was a primarily monastic church.
So what would the
you didn't know he was going to speak to you, did you? That freaked you out.
I didn't. So
out of nowhere.
Yes, please. There's a voice off camera. No, please, no.
So if it's about changing activities, what would the East recommend instead of books if the West is?
Oh well, I mean, of course, the East does have the spiritual class that has all this stuff together is the Philokalia, but it's just go to liturgy, pray the Jesus prayer, and go to liturgy, and go to liturgy, and I'll even add Lectio Divina is more of a Western thing in its term, but still it's a universal practice, and that's it.
Yeah.
Live the liturgy.
I think what
live
attracts,
it in practices.
Even today, I think what attracts Westerners to the East is the simplicity it seems to have.
Yeah.
Like Jesus prayer, liturgy, light your candles, do your bowing.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Even when you compare, and this might be an interesting kind of essay, just to kind of compare the Chotki with the Rosary as analogous to how complicated things can appear in the East versus West, right? Because I think when a Westerner first gets introduced to the Chotki, like, all right, how do I do this thing? And you're like, well, you say this one prayer.
Yeah, you say
I mean, you can say, Most Holy Theotokos, save us if you want, but you don't, just that's it. And you're like, I don't understand.
So it's, it's because when people take
you need
them
a whole
as being
manual to understand how to pray the rosary.
Yeah, and it's it's like, okay, which mystery do I have to remember?
Yeah.
It's like, no, you're just praying. You're just praying to God to forgive you as a sinner. That's it. That's what you're doing.
Glory to God.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's a kind of it's a different parallel, and I think this is appropriate. I was at St. Peter's this morning, and it was they have, I guess, downstairs in their chapel, it's perpetual adoration.
Yes.
So at various people are down there kneeling or sitting and praying, and there's a kind of like earnestness of sitting with Christ. Like there's this earnestness. And then I had my horologian, and it just structures my life as praying the liturgy of the hours. It's just my thing. Like that is not a judgment. It's just I realize it. But there I am. It probably looks complex, but it's like just over and over again, crossing myself, But in a sense, I find that to be very like loose and floopy, right? Whereas there's this earnestness of mental prayer going on among my Latin brethren there.
Yeah.
And in a sense, no matter how much I'm doing externally, I feel sort of like I'm the one who's less earnest because I'm sort of following my liturgical book. Now, there's no real insecurity there on my part, but just sort of like doing the liturgy. Doing these simple devotions, you're right.
Even
I think that takes
when you
people
look
in.
at the different liturgies, if you look at the Latin Mass, it seems more kind of militaristic.
Yes,
Whereas exactly. Whereas you look at the East, and it feels like you're in an ocean and being battered about by the waves.
Yeah,
it feels more motherly.
Yeah, go to a big divine liturgy where you have if you go to the Melkite parish down in D.C., Holy Transfiguration, they've just got scads of like subdeacons and deacons and an acolyte or servers. And it's just, it's the Arab culture too. So it's just kind of like people wandering around.
Beautifully messy.
It's beautiful. It's just so beautiful. I nudged my wife when we were there.
This is why the pews don't make sense in the East. Exactly. Maybe not even in the West, but that's another topic. But in the East, it's like, why do we have these things? Why is there order? Yeah. Now, of course, there's a tremendous and beautiful order. Yeah. But in the divine liturgy.
But to see the order is kind of like lost if you're just looking for that. It is very cut and clean. My wife loves that in the traditional Latin Mass.
I don't. I tend towards that, but only from the part of my personality that I think needs to be curbed. It's not actually a good thing in my sense. So do you think then that there is perhaps, well, let me put it this way, when you were a Westerner, did you see more of a temptation towards scrupulosity than when you journeyed east? Because that's the experience some people share with me.
This is not meant as I know my list of sins. And as I joked with my confessor the other day, I said, oh, that's nice. I know my sins are over here, and then I'll have a different set of life conditions, and that whole other part of the house that I didn't realize was leaky is also leaky. So I'm not kind of batting aside your question. Except when I was a kid, I never really had an issue with scrupulosity.
And did you eventually?
No.
No, that's nice.
No, so hence I didn't have that release from that.
The Lord, Therese of Lisieux, and the 6th session at the Council of Trent exercised me of scrupulosity, but it took a while.
Okay. Yeah. No, that was, when I was young and I was dating a really beautiful soul evangelical girl who was actually the reason that I started to take my Catholicism seriously. At that period I did.
Did you?
But no. Probably there's a sort of laxity in my personality, in my temperament that way. It's like my wife says, that last 10%. At the end is always hard for me. So, but no, what the East cured me of though was anger at the church.
How so?
It's just funny because usually people go to the East and not usually, but a lot of people go to the East and they get mad at the rest of the church because they're so mad at the Western church.
So how did it cure you of your anger towards the church?
Well, there's a sense in which with all the, all the various things that people carp on about in the online world, which probably I know I'm on too much as it is. I don't care. It's just it's sort of like you can go to the whichever complaining sites, I'd use a much stronger word than that, and see what is it that the current Pope has done or the Curia, or I have a list from my bad experiences ecclesiastically of like bishops that I could go and look and see what they're doing just to get mad. And there's a lot of things to be mad about. And that used to just pollute my life. I just don't care. It's just in the rearview mirror. I care. I pray for all of it, but emotionally.
Fair enough. And I think I understand exactly where you're coming from, and I experience what you're talking about too. But why is it the East that cured you of that anger?
Oh, well, because we don't matter to the West is one thing. So it's like, in a sense, my life has become so like I'm off the radar, Yeah. But so much of that is just their Western conversations, right? So many of those start at home with like some experience liturgically or some experience in your Western diocese.
Yeah.
And, sometimes we get these mailers from my wife's diocese because we're split ritual household. So it's like we live in two different dioceses in a sense. I'm in the Archieparchy of Pittsburgh and she's in the local diocese. We'll at least leave it there so that the next comment doesn't cause some problem. I don't want to be detractive. But sometimes you see these, the fundraising things that come from the diocese. And I throw it at her. I'm like, hey, how's your... She gets her so mad. I say your church because it's a sui juris church. It says like, how's your church working out? And she gets so mad at me. She says, you're still a Catholic, Doesn't mean I don't get worked up about it, but there was some tomfoolery. Because I want to keep it abstract enough that happened in the Latin world, tied up with just everything in the past, we'll say 10 years. You cut me off if it's inappropriate. I'm not I don't believe in being too negative about the current pontiff publicly like some people do. But there was a, set of discussions. It wasn't Amoris Laetitia, another set of discussions that came up, and I got frustrated about it. And now I'm an academic, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm not saying this is what everyone else should do. I just went and translated a book from the past that I thought was better than that, what was said. And it's a book called The True Christian Life by Father Ambrose Gardet. CUA Press is publishing it. Real beautiful meditation on divinization, our call to be Christified in grace. And that was my way of dealing with it. I just didn't have the kind of pushback anger. I was just like, this is what I'm going to do. And I don't feel the need to sort of go on the internet to see where someone is wrong, which was the temptation before that. I never was really tratty, but that kind of like wanting to be angry at everything, was a real thing I struggled with. I mean, I still do. My poor parish priest confessor, he has to hear from me all the time, the weird confessions of an ex-monk because you're mad at things ecclesiastical a way that normal parishioners just aren't.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's like, how many times have I said negative things about priests or bishops or whatever, that needs to be confessed, but it's not the same. That, it really freed me from that becoming Eastern. Yeah.
Let's talk about Catholic morality.
Yeah.
Let's talk about morality in general. What is morality?
Oh. Yeah, I could say... I used to be able to rattle off the old scholastic definition of it's a transcendental relation to the moral rule. Ultimately, moral questions become a question of how our acts should be measured, or what is the standarding of our acts? What should we be? How should we be living in our acts that are freely willed?
Yeah.
But I like to pull back from that almost immediately, right? Because ultimately, especially at the theological level, which the book was written at, morality asks the question of, are we living our destiny? Are we living the destiny that we are created to be? And then you have to ask yourself, what are we created to be? Well, we're created actually to be graced and to live quite literally through grace, the divine life of God. Like, we are adapted in our souls to live the Trinitarian life through the grace that comes to us from Christ in our life as Christians. So then what do our actions look like? Sort of what are the consequences of that? What are the character traits that we should have, the virtues, and then everything that flows downstream from that.
Now, I know we have this sort of false idea, many of us, that morality is a list of rules that don't have to do with happiness, right?
Exactly.
And I want to get to that. But before we do, I want to take kind of more of the sort of the atheist-theist discussion about objective morality.
Yeah.
I would actually be very much open to changing my mind on this, but it does seem to me, and I know it does sound maybe like an apologist theist trope at this point, but I don't see how you get objective morality if you don't have a God.
Oh, yeah. I mean, because ultimately it's hard because you need a transcendent grounding of your norms. Like we're well aware that ultimately, especially things like justice, mercy, all of these exist even in a secular mind, right? A secular person can have a vague idea of needing to be just, of needing to be fair, of needing to be merciful. It's easier with stuff with justice. Of needing to not be so attached to things in the world that you basically mess up your relationships.
Yes.
I mean, I'm trying to kind of recast the virtue language in something that a secularist could understand.
We could even see from our own subjective experiences that there are certain ways of acting that lead to me being more happy or lead to me and my family flourishing. And there are certain actions that derail that.
Exactly. And so somewhere in that insight, you start to see, you see there's something that's immaterial. Right? There's a moral law that's not limited to my specific circumstances, but I stand before that law.
Yeah, I'm not convinced of that yet. I don't see that. I don't see why one has to appeal to the immaterial right away.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well,
yeah.
okay.
Why can't morality just be an evolutionary development, useful, like our hands and eyes? They are conducive for our survival and that of the species. Why can't morality have evolved in that way? If we were raping and pillaging on a large enough scale, humanity wouldn't have ever gotten to where it's gotten.
And there's a sense in which probably some of the predispositions we have from lower stages of evolution actually do predispose certain moral things.
Right.
But who experiences, especially when you experience guilt for having done something, who experiences that as merely some kind of utilitarian? Let me try.
Yeah. So one thing I've noticed, and one of the reasons I don't read my YouTube comments anymore, and I think most people who are online, they run some kind of social media page, get this. You can read 10 positive comments, and one of them is negative, and it's so much louder than the 10 positive comments you just read. I could see somebody saying, well, we've evolved to be keenly aware of the disapproval of those within our group, because it's a good thing to remain part of that group.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure somebody said yes.
And so therefore you could say that guilt is a sort of byproduct of recognizing what I've done that's gone against the group. And so there's that.
You also have situations where people feel guilty for things that are just kind of,
that they shouldn't feel guilty for.
Yeah, flippant. No, and this is true. It's like, because there's a sense in which, of course, when I teach in the seminary, I just start at the heights of the gift of grace and come down. I don't do a lot of the apologetic stuff.
Let's start down, though. Just to think about it.
No, because, I guess, part of me wants to say, though, there has to be, in everyone's experience, I think about it as a parent. So if you're talking to someone who's a parent, this is the problem. We're in the ancient sense of ad hominem, we're arguing to a person's position, right? We're taking a person's position.
Yeah.
The ancient idea of ad hominem is that you're just conceding what someone says, like what you just did,
right,
and then try and figure out how to get out of it, right? How to argue them out of it. If someone's a parent, for instance, there are certain things that you do where you mess up the raising of your children, right? It happens all the time, and I don't think it comes from the theist part of my soul, where you just have a sense where, I don't want to make fun of you. It's like, crikey, what a fool I am. Once again, I would use a stronger word than that. And it's not mere, unless you have to have an entirely reductionistic metaphysic that's going to say to you.
That's what I want to start with.
Yeah, no, that's going to, well, I know you have to convince.
So maybe I can't understand why my eyeballs see.
Yeah.
And I can't understand why I feel guilt or shame, but I do, and I don't have to posit a God for that.
Well, and I'm not going yet to the God. Yeah. No, right now I'm staying just at the level of
or
trying
the immaterial. I don't have to posit the immaterial.
So I guess what I'm trying to get us to. So let me give you sort of that's like the Whig history. Where am I directing us to at the end here?
Okay.
Is just the insight of there is something that is more than my own sense of my place in the community, or my own self-image that condemns me. I can't put it quite into words. I'm not saying a person even. Yeah. I'm not even saying God or anything like that. I'm just saying it's really like just moral rightness. I have failed at being human, and that by itself, no matter what, if no one was around, if nobody was around me, I would still find gnawing at my conscience the idea that I've fallen short of what I am to be human.
There's no way of you just knowing that. There's no way of anybody knowing that. If I haven't come into contact with human society, I'm not sure how I would feel. Maybe I wouldn't feel any guilt.
I mean, perhaps, I have a real hard time with these styles of arguments, because I'm going to say whoever's doing this is living in such a fabricated online comment world that you've not lived life. Sometimes you want to say just, I guess you've lived on the surface of your life. I'm going to be, and I'm not trying to write you off, but it's like, go take care of your dying parent. I can say this having done it. Go do that, or go not do it and watch what your conscience, how you feel. And, ask yourself, is it merely because of, what people think of you or not? And, spend some time alone, which is hard for humans. And, deep within there, you're going to have a sense of the injustice that you did, or maybe, whenever you're, mother was a mixed bag. I mean, a good woman, but also she had some real demons with alcohol she struggled with, and I could have chosen to avoid caring for her, right? But, the sense of why did I do that was not because what's the family going to think, but it was right. Like, in the end, our relationship was better than most of the other ones she still had. And so you have to dig into a person's experience to get them to see that.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think our subjective experience of the moral order is more loudly true to us than any argument for moral skepticism.
Yes.
And it's more convincing. I think so. In my life it is. But it doesn't mean that it is that way. Maybe I could say, well, I don't understand why it is. It seems just to help her as opposed to not help her. But it does for some reason, and I'm not going to conclude moral objectivity because of that.
Well, because the next step is actually, even at the level of philosophy, it's actually quite hard, because it's an immense amount of abstraction to then make this next step from this hazy sense to then say, there's a norm, or whatever you want to call it, that is always there. It doesn't matter where it is, or what the circumstances are. But when you're faced with something where you're called to this kind of familial justice or piety, as it used to be called, it's there and it measures you. And guess what? You cannot do it, but you'll fall short.
I'm with you.
So, but that's already, you're on the pathway to a kind of like metaphysical abstraction that's more than most people.
Feel free to push back if you're thinking in my vein here against him. But
my next step is we're so marked by sin and selfish because of the effects of the fall that most of this stuff you actually just need conversion and grace and the experience of Christ to even see these natural truths.
Well, okay.
I'm a pretty strong believer in that. I become more like that.
Yeah, right. So you can't argue to it then. You
can argue after the fact in an apologetic.
It's sort of in the way Aquinas would say you can show that the Trinity is not incoherent, but you can't prove it.
I think very often on the level of even natural truths, like philosophical truths, because of how people you're arguing against are so turned toward the world, right? I mean, we would all be there by our own power. You even have to do that for like many philosophical truths. I become more and more convinced that, which does not sound like a Thomist, which is why I fit in with
I want to talk about that in a minute. Did you?
Yeah, I guess my pushback would just be that example from the beginning of people do feel guilt for things that would be kind of within understanding of the, hierarchical objective morality that people would consider just not something you need to be guilty about. Like we talk about scrupulosity. So that would be an example of sometime when someone's feeling this,
correct,
primary and, I don't want to, over characterize what you're saying, but like this divine feeling of guilt about something which is, from the
misplaced.
Yeah, no, and there's a lot of that.
Is your point then that because it can be misplaced, it might be altogether useless?
Well, it's
not in keeping, or not.
How do you, if people are feeling these primary feelings about these moral experiences, then how can that be the foundation if those things conflict? So what's different about you feeling guilty about, a family situation versus someone feeling guilty about scrupulosity? Is it a qualitative difference? How do you define that?
Yeah, that's I guess old Socrates' abuse here. You need to be able to.
That's not an argument against objective morality, is it? Like that's not what you're trying to do. Well, because that would be like saying some people are colorblind, therefore colors aren't real, or
color
people can't assess.
Yeah. Well, what if they saw colors differently? Then you couldn't say that everyone sees color objectively, and color is this objective thing. Like that's
okay.
It's not to say that there isn't some underlying objectivity too or not. It's just saying, if we're saying the reason why we know that color objectively exists is because I see it
hang on.
Particular way.
But see, now aren't we kind of making the distinction here, or shouldn't we make the distinction between moral ontology and moral epistemology? Like how we come to know things is a very different question to do those things exist. Someone might get their sums wrong, and it might seem to them that a particular math equation works when it doesn't, but it wouldn't follow that there isn't a right way of going about it.
Yeah, so that would just be my pushback, is that it seems that your argument for the ontological existence of moral truth is just an epistemological anecdote.
I jumped into the theory of knowledge, the epistemology side more quickly, because I wanted to just get it right. We're talking kind of the subjective experience. I need to sort of unpack from within the subjective experience what may eventually be the ontological claim that there are, there's something immaterial about these values, and that, in a way, is going to be a path, somewhat like what Newman does through conscience to get to God, right? But the first step is just, let's look inside your experience. And I'm using guilt because it's like a phenomenological register. It's a register within your experience that all of a sudden it puts the law right in front of you. This experience of guilt is where you feel the moral law.
100%.
It's like the moral law language I really, in a sense, don't like, because law is a derivative concept. I mean, moral law is fine, but if you think of law, you tend to think of morality like rules, which I love to avoid. I mean, you're sensing the fact that you're falling short of the very thing that you should be doing. Now, deception is manifoldly possible here. I mean, individual actions and circumstances are just, immensely complex. This is in a sense why our Lord is like, don't go judging others. Just leave that one for the angels at the end of time. But once again, I think anyone who's lived an adult life has a sense at times of things that either they were called to do. That's the positive side, not guilt, but things they're called to do, and they would feel guilty if they did not do it. And guilt doesn't need to be our main thing here. I'm not saying guilt's the only way to do this. It's just, sitting here what I've backed myself into rhetorically. But everyone's had, some sense of that if they've been mature and not merely floating about. I really do think. I think it requires a kind of perversity of an immaturity to get into that online forum kind of mentality. You want.
Let me see if I see what you're saying, because I think I agree with you. It's almost like the tail ends up wagging the dog, where it's like maybe you're beginning with the conclusion that God doesn't exist, and then you've got to rewrite and re-explain those experiences that seem so obvious to you. Yeah. Sort of like I remember when I was 17 or 16, I had a bout of solipsism, and suppose I was a solipsist, it was like the explanation I now have to come up with is far more complex than recognizing that other people do exist, even if I'm not sure how. And how it is I'm interacting with them. Yeah. It's almost like it's simpler just to dismiss everybody else and go with that hunch.
Yes.
Just as it might be simpler to dismiss the immaterial
let's say you have a completely scientific outlook, that it is all matter all the way down, which is actually metaphysically impossible, but hey, that's not our discussion right now. But if you've got that kind of, preconception, which is going to also have an atheistic side to it as well, what you don't want to leave in, you can't quite epistemologically leave in some transcendent, non-material component. And even if you're not thinking of that quite at the beginning, still those kind of reductionist arguments that would get you, to say that it's all just kind of conditioning, be it from evolution or social conditions or whatnot, is going to be it's one nice little piece in your materialist world. So you're not rocking sit down, you're going to rock the boat if you do anything else. I mean, I think some of that is motivated by that sort of thing. So, yeah, I mean, I'm arguing ad hominem in that ancient sense of ad hominem through you to someone who's not present. So I'm not sure if we finished, but I mean...
but I guess the point I'm trying to make, which you might agree with, is I don't see how you can believe yourself to be within a godless universe and think that there are certain things demanded of you.
Yes.
Because, here's why. Like, where would I base morality in? I can base morality, like, sort of, again, ontologically, either in that which is beneath me, that which is at my level, or that which is above me. Yeah. And if the supernatural, if that beyond us doesn't exist, maybe this is too simplistic a way of understanding it, but this is how I understand it. I've got beneath me or at my level. Beneath me is evolution. And I can say, well, I've evolved this way to act certain ways for my own good and the good of those I care about. Yeah. But if I now know that, then I can go against it if I'm now smart enough to know what evolution has sort of wired me to do. Now, at my level, I either have what you think of me, and maybe that concerns me, or what society thinks about me, but society has no more objective authority over me than you do in a godless universe, since society just means other people. So what am I left with to sort of embed? Now, it could be some sort of Platonic realm of justice and mercy and these sorts of things. But if I don't know. It's just, but even then, who's doing the commanding? Like, a moral command only makes sense between two minds. Yeah. And in a Platonic realm, how am I?
It's still sort of there because you're falling short of the measure. I mean, you'll have some Neoplatonists can do this. You're slipping into a kind of non-being away from the form of justice, from immaterial justice. So you can get it. There's actually like Plotinus. The whole universe is filled with morality. Because of how everything kind of the whole universe should turn back to its source by a kind of conversion. So I mean, you can do it with the Platonist. But even in Plotinus,
you have a source, you have a one.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to read Plato's on the way to Neoplatonism. I like to harmonize.
But if I get rid of Platonism and just say, well, no, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to.
But even there, you have something transcendent. Yeah. You're already on the path of something transcendent.
What do you think? What do you think about that?
So you don't
have to keep jumping in. I'm sorry.
Just to then clarify where I'm at. Then it's not to cut you out. Then, because then I think. This is to affirm that the person who acknowledges this, who may have still a completely messed up view at the level of metaphysics, and let alone faith, or a kind of theology that they've created for themselves about whether or not God exists, the moment you start on the path to acknowledging moral norms, you're already walking down a path that leads you ultimately to God. Because you are presuming there's something transcendent. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, you have to work it out. Are we going to be Platonists? Are we going to, are we going to hear the word of Christ and see that, it's ultimately a reflection of God's goodness to be reflected through us and all the virtues? But if you recognize a transcendent moral law of any sort,
Any
right?
kind, even one.
Moral measure of what I ought to be, you're already on your way, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because this is why, no, I'm not going to go there, only because it's too technical. So
You can.
well, I mean, this is why, you can read the Stoics two different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Stoic philosophers who come in that period, of later Platonism, they're very influential on the notion of natural law, but you can read them as natural law is just fulfilling our embodied nature, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can take into it a kind of transcendent idea of, we have a nature that we've received from the gods or God or whatever, and we have to, live up to that nature of what it is to be human, which is already a step on its way to a kind of transcendence. And it's that side of Stoicism that Christianity ends up feeling most comfortable with, because then it can sort of graft that onto our idea of God and our idea of the human person's place in the universe.
Have you done much reading of Nietzsche or Mackie? Because my understanding is, at least Mackie, and probably Nietzsche too, is that if there is no God, morality is. Yeah,
Nietzsche. I mean, it's that it can all be, the values can be transvalued. They can be, they're set by kind of power play. It depends on what the culture says that what the powerful in the culture have said are virtue. So this becomes part of his critique of the weakness of Christianity.
There's
something very beautiful about. There's beautiful sides to the poor and troubled soul of Nietzsche, but. Yeah, just got to defend the poor guy, But my first ever published thing was a Nietzschean thing.
Oh, yeah?
From when I was in seminary, yeah. But anyway, but you're correct.
I'm interested to hear about that. But just to get in some pushback while we're still on the topic of basis
no,
of
Theosis.
We'll get there.
Okay.
Basically, just we were saying before that we have the ontological idea of morality and whether it's objective and things like that or not. And then we said that we were slipping into an epistemological understanding of morality, where it's like, well, we just kind of innately sense these things. So I would just say that the kind of the argument for the subjectivity of morality would be based in what you said, in that idea of you felt, this moral sense very strongly. Other people feel this moral sense very strongly. It's a very normal thing, but that can't necessarily be the basis of an understanding of an ontologically objective
correct.
Morality, because people do differ in the way that they feel these things. So is that the foundation for this ontologically
subjective experience?
Is it subjective
experience? Do you realize how hard it is to prove there's an external world?
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Yes.
Because you have to get all the way down to the veracity of our senses, our external senses, touch down in really existing reality as such. For a Thomist, that takes the whole course of metaphysics and beyond. It takes a lot to get there, because the first thing we know, it's how Aristotle starts though, right? The first and most short principle in book 4 of the Metaphysics is, he's done other stuff, he has his natural philosophy, but to really get down to even starting a critique is, all right, listen, say a word, and I'm going to show you how being and non-being are opposed to each other. And this is, the principle of non-contradiction. It's just this really abstract first step from within our experience of basically using names that you can start to see this. It doesn't actually tell you anything yet about the external world being real. You have to do a whole bunch of steps in between, right? But you do start with what's implied in your experience, because the implication within your experience is already going to bespeak its grounding in the world. It's just you have to really work yourself out from there. I think that we're trying to accomplish much more here than you can just on even my starting point, right? It requires a ton of metaphysics to make all the steps from and that's what you're sensing, is that there's a lot more to be done here, because otherwise you could just say, yeah, it's still all very subjective. Well, there's a sense in which you could say, well, hey, Aristotle, it's really subjective that you told someone to use a name, and you're going to prove your first principle of metaphysics, which is being,
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that
I'm probably I didn't expect it to go this way. The people at Ascension, when they see this video, they're just going to be weeping. They're going to be like, we wanted to sell books. My book, people, is written for normal people, I assure you. But this is an enjoyable conversation, so just come along for the ride for a bit.
Yeah.
It seems to me what you're getting at is just that basically morality, in some sense, we all experience subjectively, in that we're the ones experiencing it, but we're still, presumably experiencing objective.
Yeah, it's like the path after this is to show what is happening in the phenomena of your experience now is implying.
Yeah.
Objectivity ultimately implies something about reality, as long as it doesn't have deception. So you have to talk about deception and all that. But objectivity has within it, like for just to have objects of knowledge already has built in there.
Yeah.
Something that's
real.
Which
kind of talking about properly basic beliefs in a sense, right? Like, like I cannot prove the external world exists. I actually don't know how I would possibly do that.
Yeah.
I don't know how to prove that history is 5 minutes old with the appearance of age.
Yeah.
I don't know how to prove that you exist and are not just some sort of a robot, sophisticated looking robot.
Yeah.
I actually don't. And people do have, what's his name? 17th century French, bloody hell, Descartes. Descartes had that sense, right? That the as you say, the veracity of our
truthfulness,
of our senses can be deceived.
Yeah.
But I don't go from they can be deceived, therefore the external world doesn't exist. I might do that.
Yeah.
And similarly, I don't have to go from, well, my guilt might be misplaced, therefore there's no such thing as sort of objective moral facts.
But it just takes tons of unpacking. But you try to just, rhetorically, you try to just get the punch. If you're talking to someone, get them to a place without, don't reduce them to tears over their dead parent, you know what I mean? But find something in their life where they had the profound sense of what they should do.
If I torture your daughter, please don't go there right away.
That's not advised, people.
Yeah.
But I'm probably really influenced in the back of my mind by my professor, Monsignor Robert Sokolowski, who was a sort of mixed phenomenologist and Aristotelian Thomist. So he lived in both the world of scholastic talk, but also phenomenology because of his era of training at Louvain. And probably elements of that have all seeped into my Thomism. I'm not isomorphic with him. I'm not the sort of one-to-one with him, but he profoundly left a mark on me in graduate school. It was just the best professor I ever had. It's no insult to other professors, but he was head and shoulders and very staid character, had a very staid, he wasn't like a big ebullient character, his conversations would not be like this, but he was just a profound soul. So there's I'm no phenomenology guy, but there's this phenomenology that found its way into my thought. So I take very seriously. It's like the object, which doesn't necessarily yet mean it's a reality, but the object of my experience may well have hidden within it this path that takes us toward the transcendent grounding of it all.
We can move on from this, but I just sort of want to sum up by saying, making that analogy from the external world and objective moral facts. If one object outside of me exists, just one, then it follows that the external world exists. Likewise, if one thing can be shown to be a moral duty, be a
transcendent measure that I must, in a sense, bow the knee of my will before.
Yeah, if just one thing, then it would follow that there's an objective moral realm.
Exactly. And then it's a question of what that is. Is it a bunch of forms like Plato or whatever, but all of a sudden there's something above me. And boy, for an atheist, it's a dangerous path after that. Because, I will say that, either philosophically or ultimately theologically as well, through faith, it's a path that leads to God, and a path that, with sufficient proposition of the mysteries, leads to Christ. So
so moving away from that, how do you think many Catholics understand morality in an inappropriate or improper way?
Yeah, you said it already. It's a list of rules. It's the precepts of the church and the precepts of the natural law or something like that. That there's morality is ultimately a discussion about, what are the rules that I have to follow at certain times, and sort of the guidance that I should follow in my life as well, which is not wrong, but it's sort of like the lowest part of morality, right? I mean, not the lowest part, like as in kick it away, but it's so derivative from, really the fact that, morality is ultimately, or moral theology unpacks everything that's involved in the claim that all of our acts are to have as their principles these virtues, which ultimately in their most profound place are the theological virtues, and you would actually call yourself a Thomist, I would presume. Do you use that?
I don't necessarily.
I have to, even though I have to because of the nature.
Because I'm not even sure
work.
what we mean by Thomist. I think people mean different things.
Yeah, I've got a real cramped.
What you said earlier about reading the Thomists is far more difficult than reading Thomas.
Yes.
So it depends what you mean by a Thomist. Do you mean metaphysically? Do you mean?
Yeah, it's I just find myself to be a member of the Thomist school as a big discussion group. The traditional Thomist school, but the Thomist position, which I think it's correct, but it's not.
But what position?
I'm getting there. Sorry, okay. It's not de fide, but it's a theological position about the infused moral virtues.
I see.
There are Christian moral virtues that derive also from faith, hope, and charity that influence our justice, that influence or courage, etc. There's a Christian courage, a Christian prudence, a Christian justice, etc. So all of that, like unpacking the implications of all of that apparatus of what we are as Christians. What is it that our life should be? Our life should be a kind of wellspring by which grace passes through faith, hope, and charity primarily, then all the Christian moral virtues, but even all the natural aspects of the natural law become subservient to what ultimately is a divine call to union with the Blessed Trinity as members of the mystical body of Christ. Because morality is not, from a Christian perspective, especially from a Catholic and Orthodox perspective, merely kind of moral philosophy with a golden Christ, a topping on it, right? Like we take the natural law, we kind of take some of the discussions, sort of things we've been talking about now, and we sort of say, but of course Christ is the model for us.
I see.
No, it's because it's actually just part of theology, and theology is just one thing. Theology is just the discursive unpacking of the mystery of God in Himself or God with us, but it's all God all the way down. Right? It's the two great credibilia, the two great things that we believe are that God exists as Holy Trinity, and that God is a merciful and provident, just, yes, but merciful and provident God. And that's, most fully seen in the greatest gift that was ever given, which is the grace of union, as the theologians call it, or the incarnation of Christ and His whole life through His passion, death, and resurrection. And everything else just falls under that. So to do moral theology is just to ask the question of, what does God in us, in our action, look like? Because that's what the Christian moral life is. So.
Cool.
Sorry, yeah. So from an Eastern perspective, right, this is the idea of theosis.
Yeah.
We are to becoming divine.
Right.
Sometimes in the West, it would be referred to under the rubric of divinization.
Yep.
And it is fair. The Orthodox, for instance, in a kind of polemic, say it's all legal following of rules. That's what Roman Catholics think. It's unfair. There is such a rich appreciation of divinization. It's at the heart of Thomism. It's the heart of other schools too. It's the heart of Thomas's moral theology. Is the idea. Some people talk about it as happiness and beatitude, but ultimately too, the deep roots of this is the fact that it is in the gift of grace we are living God's life quite really. It's not pantheism, we're not being absorbed into God, but the very object of faith, hope, and charity, which are the soul then of every other act that we have, is God in His Trinitarian mystery. So that's everything else downstream from that is just changed because of what the gift of grace is and what our vocation is. But there's something true to the Orthodox claim because of various vicissitudes after the Reformation. In particular,
for sure.
There was a lot of legalism that was kind of where do the rules fall? There were all debates. Like St. Alphonsus, in a sense, is kind of gloried among moral theologians that he brought a lot of that to a halt. All these debates over conscience, just where am I free to do something? It's kind of like the teenager, how far can I go with my girlfriend without sinning? There was a lot of that in the West. But a couple of the really profound Dominican theologians.
Pink hairs?
I've got to kind of... pink hairs is good. Pink hairs is good.
Yeah.
But, the people that pink hairs refuses to mention because people in the 60s decided they didn't want to mention the people they learned from. Sorry, this is like a blood... It's like a blood feud for me. Pink hairs is good. Okay. But go read Juan Arentero, Ambrose Gardet, Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. Yeah. It's all this. There's stuff in that everyone thinks Pink Hairs critiqued. He was the first one to critique, casuistry or something.
I see.
It's all throughout the guys a generation or two before him. Okay. And it bothers me.
Why doesn't he reference them? Or at least reference them sufficiently?
No, I mean, some of it may just be accidental. So I don't want to cast that anger part of my soul. I think some of it is, the bad experience of like World War II and what people thought about the conservatives of that generation. Some of them didn't get on board quickly enough against the French government that was stuck in by Hitler. It's very unfair, though. People make claims of anti-Semitism that are just not true, not true at all. Some of it was some bad experiences in the 40s and 50s in some theological debates that then after the council, just the generation just wanted to act as though they had no teachers. And it was, we don't want to, that kind of preconciliar, postconciliar attitude, even in a lot of conservative, faithful guys, exists because they're living sort of after the council, and there's a real, get very mad about this, an attitude that a certain party won, that the be it the progressives one, or not trying to get you in trouble here, but even you'll find Bishop Barron will talk about how the Communio school won. Hans Urs von Balthasar, Henri de Lubac, Ratzinger, and others. They won against a certain dry neo-scholasticism beforehand, and there's a kind of basis for that. It's so horribly divisive though of how these guys were trained, and in the Dominicans in a sense didn't. None of those figures I just mentioned were Dominicans. So they did not have the ascendancy with the kind of conservatives after the council. And so there really was a rejection of what came before. And they had to float around and finally say, it's safe for us to talk about. So you have up here one of my Garrigou translations. It's safe for us to talk about Father Garrigou Lagrange. People used to kind of up their sleeves say, his spiritual theology is good. But that's all they would say because they thought he was an anti-modernist, blah, 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 blah. But no one would talk about it. And I kind of bitterly want to say it took a layman to translate the stuff so that now you people feel safe. Now, there was a movement from we could say it was another layman, 10 years earlier. Father Aidan Nichols wrote a book on Garrigou. He gave some lectures at either Cambridge or Oxford. But it was Matthew Levering. Dr. Matthew Levering got that published. So it's the cunning of laymen made these priests finally feel like they could talk about their older school again because they didn't want to seem like they were against the council.
I got you.
Because traditionalists took over a lot of that preconciliar stuff. So that's what I think motivates Bishop Barron on some of this is sort of his bad experiences with traditionalists is that he just sees the scholastics as being the scholastics of the late 19th century and early 20th century as being preconciliar people who ultimately would have been in line with the trads. I think that's, sadly. Now, so Father Pincares is echoing, though. He's echoing the glories of that earlier generation.
Sum that up for us then.
So,
those at home.
Basically what I just...
We've just said it.
So what I just said about, theology is ultimately a reflection on the divine mysteries across the board. Every single thing. They're not departments, nothing else. The mysteries of Christ are the mysteries of our life. The mysteries of the Trinity are the mysteries of our life. The mysteries of Christ are the mysteries, ultimately the grounding for the mysteries of the church, which, is kind of gets us back to our idea of the Trinity because the Father sends the Son who through his mystical body incorporates us into himself so that through the Spirit we're led back by kind of reflow, to the Father, right? And then in the world of morals, then morals is just about moral theology. It's just about how do I understand, that divine vocation, which has its rooting in the Trinity, and yet every single person, every lay person, etc., is called to that life. People know this under the rubric of the universal call to holiness, but people were talking about this, long before. And some of the I think Juan Arentero and Father Gardet. So in my book, I quote Father Gardet a ton because I was editing that translation at the same time. But Father Garrigou too, they just exposited this magnificently. Father Garrigou Lagrange taught at the Angelicum in Rome, right, from 1909 to 61 or something. And there are stories about him even in the 50s. So it's after World War II. So really, there's no reason to see him as some horrible Nazi collaborator, which no one really does. There's just a kind of progressive who wants to sort of still say that, but everyone knows that's a lie. But he'd fill the big hall at the big lecture hall with people to come to his spiritual theology course because it was just laying this out. But, it's like when I gave a Garrigou book to my aunt, who was my confirmation sponsor. I thought, I was in graduate school. I was like, you're going to love this. She's like, I don't get to talk to you enough. Do you want to, this is like when Skype was kind of in, do you want to Skype and you can explain your gift to me once a week?
I can't even pronounce the man's name.
Yeah, I know. It's so. So, I wrote my book in a sense to echo at a lower level, which I don't mean with any scorn whatsoever, the riches of that tradition that I inherited, right? It's not meant to, I tried to actually make it very scriptural in its basis so that it doesn't sound like I'm just parroting Aquinas, but I wrote it to sort of bring that idea of theosis, of divinization to the people.
It's almost like we went from moral ontology and arguments against God or for God based on our subjective experience to the heights of the study of morality.
Yeah.
Can we maybe go somewhere in the middle now?
Yeah, okay, so we've done this, right? We've grounded it in the Trinity. So, morality is going to discuss, for instance, what do all the different virtues look like? So to say that our life is life in grace, which is ultimately incorporating us into Christ. I'm going to keep doing this because I really want to kick my heels out against just a kind of morality is about norms sort of thing. I mean, not because that's wrong, but because you really got to keep grounding things in the Trinity if you're going to do moral theology right. and then in Christ and his capital grace, his grace as head of the church. But then, okay, so faith, first flowering of the divine life of grace. People tend to think of faith, hope, charity. I mean, charity is different, right? Charity, people tend to think is like either giving to the poor or being nice. We'll get there. Before we talk even about other moral virtues, we have to see, for instance, that our minds are divinized. Our minds know the supernatural life, the deep things of God, as St. Paul says. The deep things of God, the supernatural life of God, the mysteries of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, obscurely, as in a mirror, etc. But it's not merely faith, it's not trust. This is a very kind of post-Protestant thing. There's a sense in which a trust element is there, right? But faith is ultimately the acceptance of certain truths precisely because, on the one hand, God has revealed them, but also because he has moved the depths of our soul to enable us to do it.
Yeah,
like God is through and through and through and through and through and through the one who is present in the theological virtues, which are at the basis of what we'll say that sounds more moral, right? Because notice how close, and what we're going to be talking about for, well, I'll say the next 5 minutes, but realistically maybe the next 20, sounds like spirituality.
Which bit?
Everything I'm saying now and what I'm going to say for the next 20 minutes probably.
Right.
It's going to sound like spirituality because morals and spirituality are really close. Because ultimately the mystical life is what the moral life is about. And that's because it starts in its very fundamental root by the divinizing, the illumination of our minds through faith. And if you don't appreciate that bit of what it means to have supernatural vision, everything else doesn't make sense. Because then the hope we have, maybe I'm going to back up. I'm going to say this too. We don't believe because the church, the Thomist school's developed position against many Jesuits is that we don't believe because the church proposes it. The church is a necessary condition, and I mean that, not like something you can kick away. She's the necessary condition for proposing through the ages, surely and distinctly, the truths of faith. But we believe because God has moved us. There's something that sounds very Protestant in that if you don't understand that the Thomists really hold the church as necessary. But we don't believe ultimately on the church, on the church, even on the church's authority, that faith is ultimately on the authority of God who reveals. I assure you that's correct. I translated 700,000 words by Garrigou in his On Revelation, which is coming out.
It makes sense to me.
I know, but some people, like, I sometimes rhetorically get that in there in case anyone's trying to push back that, he's saying something woolly-haired. But if you appreciate that then, and you appreciate the fact that it really is a kind of supernatural eye, right? The gift of faith. Our minds are raised to a kind of participation in the divine light. Well, then the next step, for instance, hope, our wills have to be.
Just pause on faith for a moment. How many of us in the last 24 hours or week or month or year have prayed for the gift of faith or a deeper faith?
Yeah. It's like
because of what you're saying, I think. We think of faith as a sort of trust, which it is.
Think of like, for instance, so Dom Marmion, when I was just reading in Mysteries of Christ, he says, every time you read the gospel, you should ask for faith, not just as trust, but, Lord, when I'm reading these words about you, work within me so that my mind grasps that here is the incarnate word of God. There's no distinction here except between the persons, right? That is the Godhead. So in order for me to truly grasp that, I have to have the very Godhead itself as the object of my mind to understand who you are in your person. Give me the faith I need to see that. And then it's like, only then will I understand what you say, because it will be in light of that supernatural mystery. I will only understand what you've come to reveal about the Father if I understand that. How often have we prayed for that in faith? And that's not, I'm not judging anyone for not, why don't people know this? I think an angry part of me before I became Byzantine did, right? It's a misplaced anger because what the anger is, why was I not taught that? But it's, those are the truths. This is like this line from my video that I really liked from Ascension, and I keep using it all the time now, but it worked well. Truths of faith are the truths of our lives. You need to really appreciate that if you're then going to understand anything else. Now, as Catholics, of course, we're well aware, normally we talk about faith and works, right? But another way to see it is the impulse of faith goes further. It's got to pass through the whole being. It's got to divinize our will as well. We're just talking about, our mind. The will is actually involved here, but we can't talk about that because everything can't be done here. So someone who's mad at me about that, please know that I'm aware. But, hope, for instance, what does it mean to have hope in God? The firm foundation of our hope is our crucified Lord, right? The God who goes that far to save his recalcitrant people. It's like, you think about Genesis, whatever, so I have no problem. I know you've got a young earther coming on, relatively soon for a debate.
For those at home, this Thursday, we're going to be I'll be hosting a debate between Jimmy Aiken and Gideon Lazar on young earth creationism. Both Gideon, who we've had on the show, and Jimmy, obviously, are both Catholics. So subscribe to the channel so you won't miss that one.
He didn't tell me to do that.
Thank you.
I don't know boundaries sometimes. So I have no problem with evolution, but there's a moment where all of a sudden the dispositive conditions for apes all of a sudden passes the threshold where actually, no, God infuses a spiritual soul. Our first parents, Adam and Eve, are created, and boy, we messed that one up really quickly. And yet the whole rest of history becomes this divine mercy rescue mission, with all the recalcitrants that it seems to wear God out. I mean, all it takes is till Noah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Wash them under, right?
Yeah.
But then all the stuff that you get in the prophets to see there's the God who is striving for Israel to be his people, right? Is our hope, our will must be fixed with a short, we're no universalists here. I'm not trying to get you in trouble. Bringing up things like you had in your interview with Ralph Martin.
Yeah.
But we do have a firm foundation for our hope in Christ. And God does will all of us to be saved. I mean, but you can reject this. But we have the infinite, saving, redemptive omnipotence of God that should be the first disposition that we have toward our salvation. The good that we desire for ourselves is our salvation. We're going to have to go further than this, but the good that we desire for ourselves really is our salvation, because our salvation is found in living the divine life we were given through grace. And the hope for that actually to be accomplished ain't in ourselves, right? It's only in Christ. And is he more in us? How many different refrains are in St. Paul along those lines? That Christ may be all within me. So you can see why I kind of went to the heights first, because notice how I had to pull the heights down in to make, once again, see how high the vocation is. But you got to go further, because of course our salvation is ultimately, if we're aware of the implications of what I just said, is ultimately about the great and infinite goodness of God himself, who's, infinitely good in a Trinitarian way of the interpenetration of the divine love of persons that we can't even, it's so hard to put into words. It's far better than merely like my salvation, right? It is the infinite goodness of God itself, the good, of God himself, three persons, is the love of my life. There's a kind of, I'm definitely stealing from Ambrose Gardet here, there's a kind of, to use a rough word of a mystic, heart transplant that God has to do, by which the very fire of our capacity to love, which is the will, the spiritual appetite that we have, the spiritual desire that we have, the spiritual joy that we take, has to rest by our vocation and grace in God alone. Not merely God as Lord, not merely God as Master, not merely God as Creator. The philosophers can tell us about that. In the God who's called us to a friendship to participate in the sending of the Son and the sending of the Spirit and the return to the Father, to walk in the halls of the Godhead is what our vocation is. I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. Oh, that's nice sounding. Do you really want to treat your Lord's words like that and just dismiss them as nice pieties in the most, John the theologian, the most profound of the gospel writers? No, he means what he says. So much so, Thomas, his first analogy that he uses to try to understand charity. It's okay if you don't know. Do you know
I don't know it.
Oh, I'm surprised. Like maybe Father Pine or someone on here.
He may have, and I may have forgotten it. I forget a lot of things.
That's fine. These Australians are so quick talking and so happy. That they forget things. No.
Yes, I do.
ADD. No. That's fine. It's fine because people don't stress this enough. Friendship. He uses, right, he sees he gets in his bag of tools.
Yes.
And he's like, okay, they're all reading a lot of Aristotle at his time, right? And so he's like, what in my Aristotelian philosophical tool bag is going to be best? And, friendship. By which, friendship is involving, willing the good of the other. That's what everyone says. But you have to be really careful here when you say that. So there are some goods, of course, that we can just sort of will for our own use. I mean, we got to subordinate that to higher things, but it's true of food, and things of that sort, lower things, You can will the good of another, though, and it's not mutual. Right? You can wish well for someone who's down on hard times. And that's, quite, It's quite good, and we tend to stop there because we see how, in a sense, God did that for us. But God doesn't merely. I'm going to say it this way, but my book is actually dedicated to a dear, holy evangelical Protestant woman to whom I owe an immense amount, who is sort of like a second mother to me. So I don't mean to be throwing a Protestantism under the bus or something here, but a classically Protestant idea of salvation is that we are holy by Christ's merits, but it's his merits imputed to us, right? As though God looks at us and is like, I will the best for you, and cover yourself with my holiness. He wants to go further beyond that kind of benevolence love. He wants it to be mutual. He wants it to have that mutuality that friends can have, right? And I mean, the friend, it's not merely like, hey, I know my friend loves me. No, there's a real sense in the mutual relationship. Spouses experience this, but a good friend too. When you say someone, he understands me, it doesn't just mean, oh, he can guess what I'm going to say. It's kind of like, I remember my oldest was 2. It was during the summer of COVID. 2 and something, and we were sitting out back at my house, and I thought of my mother. I was mad about something. It was all that terrible for an extrovert, that terrible I've seen no one, and even my stepfather who he died in the middle of the COVID stuff. And luckily we got through his head that we should see each other because he didn't really go out and do much. So I said, we're a bubble. We're fine. but for a while he was kind of like, oh, I'm being careful, blah, 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 which I understand. I'm not writing down the disease, but all that psychological stress of that, it was kind of at the peak of that. And I just couldn't put something into words. And I was trying to get it to my wife to get her to understand, trying to, and she couldn't. And I just started bawling. I'm very realistic about my mother being dead. I thought she's the only person who could put this into words. I've said this about my stepfather too, right? It's not merely that, oh, they lived with me for a long time, so they get it. There were times I called my stepdad, and he's the only guy who could. He's the only person who could put my soul into words. That's what the mutuality of friendship is like. And I didn't plan this as a kind of like endpoint to get to. I mean, that's just, and sort of sharing as 2 men in Christ publicly.
Put my soul into words.
Yeah, put my soul into words. So, commenters comment on other things, but don't comment on this because this comes from a deep place. That's to try and phenomenologically get like what that mutuality of friendship looks like. That's what God wants for us in grace. That's what charity is, ultimately, is to live in that mutuality, and then it should flow out. That flows out over everything else, right? It's not merely observing his commandments as loving God above all things. It is that, but it's like, okay, that's more of like the moral virtues. Is your entire life on fire for God in every one of its aspects? Do you see God everywhere? You ever, Tevye, we're talking about Fiddler on the Roof earlier, much earlier. You've seen Fiddler on the Roof?
Yeah, a long time ago.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't know. My wife hates musicals, but she actually likes Fiddler basically, but she hates them. It's that sort of.
I tend to hate them as well.
Yeah, it's understandable. It is. But all these scenes where Tevye's talking to God, right? He's always, oh Lord. He's always looking up. I remember when I was a monk, when I was so mad doing that. I mean, that's what every moment of our life should be, though. That you're seeing. He's down to every iota of everything that's positive in our action. It's only the sin that he's not the cause of, which is really just a kind of non-being that we can create non-being, which is not creating anything, right? Everything else is this reflection of him. Like, do we live in that and rest in that and make that just the soul of our life? It's so hard to put the idea of acts of charity into words. It's not a long section of the Summa even, right? But all of our is God alone. Like all your loves, ultimately, do they key down in that? God alone in his mystery, because boy, he's called me providentially to this special place in his plan to now live with him here and in eternity. Am I abiding in God? That's what charity is primarily. That's what it is primarily. Now, the extension of that, which is not merely just a case of liberality or generosity, is fraternal charity. We tend to think of fraternal charity as, what do you think of fraternal charity as? Because you've been very giving. You've left me. You've just let me go on a stem winder.
That's terrific. When I think of fraternal charity, the friendship between brothers, I think of it basically what you said: to will your good for your sake and to do whatever I can that's reasonable to bring that about.
Yeah. So notice even there though, it stays at the level of a kind of
me and you.
Well,
me,
or that
you.
one directionality, right? Now it often may have that as sort of its beginning, right? You're doing,
but it's reciprocated.
Yeah. Where it's going is, I want to love you this way, yes, because for instance you're on hard times, or you are my close friend, or you are my brother in Christ.
When I say good, I don't mean merely a sort of temporal good.
Yeah.
I want your sanctification.
But let's keep going though, right?
Yeah.
Let's keep going, because what's the implication there? So it could sound like a kind of like Puritanism of sorts, right? I want to make sure that you're in good grace, which is not wrong. But the goal of that is so we can live. My mother had a real tortured life with the church. I want to look across the beatific vision and see the tear-filled eyes of my mother, that she was saved at the last minute, and to see her true joy. Mm-hmm. That's the soul of fraternal charity. And yes, it expresses itself in, all the acts of almsgiving or spiritual correction or whatever else. Father Gardet has these wonderful lines about spiritual or fraternal correction, where he reads the riot act against the moral theologians who basically say, oh, well, all the conditions are usually not there because you don't know the people well enough. He's like, Christ's words weren't quite so qualified as the moral theologians today. But the soul of that is you want that. It's like the story, and I use this in the book. Don't forget about the importance of almsgiving. Don't forget about the importance of mercy, right? Because mercy is, in a sense, Christ in the Sermon on the Mount makes this clear. It's like how to be perfect like your Father. Yeah, he rains down his good on good and ill. Mercy doesn't do away with justice, but even Thomas says in all of God's works, mercy is presupposed to his justice, because to our nothingness, we don't deserve to exist at all because we're creatures, and we don't deserve our redemption. And yet he does both. All of this is very important, but the soul of it is like the story of Benedict of Nursia, St. Benedict and St. Scholastica. She's coming up to her death.
Yes.
And they're together at the end, right? And,
it's a cute story.
Exactly. And he wants to, St. Benedict is away. They're sort of, secondary monastic building. And, they're talking of spiritual things. And, he has to go back to the monastery. And, his sister said, wants him to stay. They want to converse in the divine things. And so she weeps and prays, and God makes it rain. And he says, what have you done, sister? But she got what she wanted because she loved more. She wanted to commune. She wanted to be together with the brother whom they set the foundation for Western monasticism. They communed more in their filiation from God through grace than they did in their filiation from their parents. And she wanted to be present in that. Anyone who's really shared spiritual goods. There's a monk at St. Vincent. I remember he was down in D.C. He was kind of a head of mission for the college. And he called me up and he said, hey, I'm in D.C. It was when I was in graduate school. He's like, you want to come down and have dinner and we can just get together. And I didn't leave the hotel until like 2 or 3, and all we talked about were spiritual things. That sounds like, churchy people talking about church things. No, it was rejoicing in God, because that's what we're going to do in eternity. And it was, God in the midst of it. I mean, he's an Irishman himself. And so with all the bodiness of a holy Irishman, just rejoicing in the many things of God's goodness in life, as we're catching up, and shared life, and God himself and his mysteries, just all of that. That's like what the whole of heaven is like. People think that sounds like a terrible, really long divine liturgy or really long mass, No, it's the flash of the ever-existent God present with no parts all at once. It's like whatever you like doing. The examples I use are like when I ski. So I use the organ example very often, like a person who's really into playing an organ piece. They're just in the moment. That's like a touch. It's like a reflection of eternity. But if you're having a really good day on the slopes and you're not thinking about going down the slope, you're just skiing down the slope. It's a bug bothering me. That's like a taste of what all of a sudden, beyond all of our analogies, all of heaven is like. That's the soul of what charity is. And that's the soul of the Christian life. And then everything else becomes a kind of it becomes easier after that. Yeah. That's why it's worth doing this. So in my book, of course, I take time just to unpack it over multiple chapters. It's like the whole first section is trying to unpack all of this stuff over sufficient space that it doesn't feel, too technical.
Right.
Right. Because I want people to know this. It's like when I teach it at the seminary. Say, this is the vocation of everyone. Teach it to the people, all the moral stuff then starts to fall into place after that. If you see that, okay, well then there are certain relationships we have with other people, and there are going to be all sorts of different types of justice. It's like the biggest treatise. Like, you open up your Summa and you go to the part where he talks about justice. It's huge. Well, some people could say it's like, get our Orthodox hat on, legalism. Look at all that legalism, law, justice, rights, No, it's because there are so many different ways we can talk about relationships with others and other institutions and those who are above us, and technically those who are below us. I mean, this is why it's so big. It's like there are all kinds of things to talk about there. And it's a neat section. So this is Father Michel Labradette, the forgotten one that Pincare's overshadowed. It's half Father Labradette's fault. Taught for a long time at Toulouse, and he has these notes from his teaching. They're immense, like this much on a shelf, but like they were in photocopy, whatever, the mimeograph. They floated around, and they're finally getting published now. He's talking about fraternal. I don't remember if it's in his fraternal charity or his justice section. He makes this point where how people tend to think about like friendliness or generosity as charity. Be charitable, do to people, where you don't have a real debt to do it to them. I say, notice how what I talked about was quite mystical. It goes further even what I said about charity, because we could go through all the mysticism of the perfecting of the life through the mystical ways in what I just said. We owe injustice to other people. So I always have to do this because I speak so quickly, in space justice. Yes. Thank you. You're like, we owe injustice to people?
That doesn't sound right.
And thank you for joining us today. We're done. We owe out of a kind of justice to people to be friendly to them, not, giddy. Not everyone's going to be like, it seems like you have a bit like my temperament, the lightheartedness, but, to not be a bore with them, That's a question of justice.
Yes.
I think that's kind of cool, though.
It is cool.
It's like liberality.
Yes.
Like when I would teach, I taught while I was finishing my PhD in a night school program at Mount St. Mary's. It was great. Non-traditional students and military guys. And I loved it, right? People who are just trying to get a leg up in life and get a degree later on. And so we would read sections of the Nicomachean Ethics, and I used a little book by Sade, because he was accused of some stuff a couple years ago. Jean Vanier has a beautiful book from the 60s on Aristotle and happiness, and I used it at the time. And I like to stress about liberality, generosity, like owing money to people for no reason. It doesn't mean like just like giving to the beggar. It's like whatever in your circumstances. Like if you know someone who could use something and it wouldn't insult them, and it's appropriate, you can do it in an appropriate way. You just owe it to other people to like share with the blessings you have, whatever they happen to be. And, that's just a question of justice. So don't tell yourself that like, oh, you failed in charity. You just are unjust if you don't do that. Boy, our society would be different if people took that to heart. Boy, would it be different. Religion is actually a subspecies of justice as well, because the religious observance, the recognition
Define
of
justice
God.
for us.
Before rendering to another that which is owed.
Fair enough. Okay,
there you go.
So why is religion?
There
a
you
matter
go.
of
So
justice?
because you're rendering to another that which
is
owed to them, and that debt goes in all kinds of directions. Because we owe to recognize, in our acts to recognize our ordering as creatures to God. We need to recognize our dependent status upon God. And we would say as a Christian, because we have a much more keener, just merely philosophical understanding, salvation history gives us this too, right? He or she who has meditated on the whole swath of salvation history owes to God the recognition of all that he has done for humanity. It's just our acts should reflect that, like our external acts should reflect that. And that's the generative source of what religious obligation is. And it's a kind of justice. Now, at the heart of that, religion's an interesting virtue because it's on the borders of the theological virtues and the moral virtues. But it remains a kind of external act. Now we see though the Mass, the Divine Liturgy, shows this so beautifully how close they are, because in a sense all of the liturgy. It's fine. This fly is.
I don't know why he's only interested in you.
It's the beard balm. He's very smelling my beard balm. The Mass, the Divine Liturgy, or even Liturgy of the Hours, but let's keep it Mass and Divine Liturgy, is a religious act. It's an external thing, right? Like you need to, in a fitting way. There's like a whole critique of bad liturgy in there. In a fitting way, recognize God and his mysteries in a way that recognizes the Church's unfolding history of her liturgical form, etc. But that's all about our external acts. But at the core of the Mass and the Divine Liturgy is an act which is in no way human, because it's just through the instrumentality of the priest that is Christ's act, the flash of the transubstantiation, where now substantially he is present among us. So you see how religion is this antechamber through our acts to then bring us to the mystical life of union with God.
Yeah.
And it's very important to make this distinction between the two. And it seems very heady. So my dear Father Boniface Hicks and I were talking once from St. Vincent, and I kept insisting to him on this, and it was also something about prayer. It's like, you have to distinguish religion as a question of justice from the mystical life and charity, and you can't slur them together, because religion is about our external acts versus then, the love of God, the devotion to God, the adoration of God that goes on in charity. Because the same thing goes here with prayer as well. The Thomists use prayer in a very, very, very technical sense, just to refer to petitionary prayer. And what we tend to put in there about like meditation and everything else, they stick in the theological virtues. And so here is this distinction. And he was like, you don't, why make those distinctions? And, it was either he or another Benedictine who's very dear to me, who I had the same argument with, eventually came back and said, yeah, Father Gardet and the Thomists in general, they're right to do that. Never mind. So there's like a pride for me. It's like, for once, I won with a priest. So it's real technical sounding, but it's, it's interesting to think about how religion is just a question of justice. It's, we tend to...
That's good. So when you're telling your children why they should attend Holy Mass, it's not so you can do something nice for God. It's because, no, you owe it and every breath of your being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, dignum et justum est. I don't know what the Slavonic is, right? But, it is right and just. It is right and just.
Yeah. I want to move away from the more this mystical stuff. I want to talk about.
So we have courage. We have courage, prudence. I mean, I hope at some point in our conversation we do prudence and conscience, and then temperance.
All
so
right.
Like, you descend me down.
Let's
into
do
this
that.
stuff.
We'll go into those other ones. Then I want to talk about what makes something intrinsically evil or not. Yeah. I also was trying to write my my master's thesis on. I was trying to argue for why consuming pornography is intrinsically evil. I couldn't do it without teleology, without bringing it in. I was trying to just base it on Wojtyła's personalistic norm. I want to see maybe if you can help me with that.
Sure.
But before we do that, I want to take a quick break and then we'll be back. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, sweet.
All right.
Thanks. Don't hit the camera. All right, welcome back to Pints with Aquinas with Dr. Matthew Meinard. No?
Meinard.
Get
the nerd. Get the nerd in there.
And
all
me.
Right.
I want to let everybody know, too, who supports us on Locals and Patreon, that we always do post-show wrap-up videos. Sometimes we talk about things that YouTube would probably ban us for, let's be honest. And so if you want to get access to all of those post-show wrap-ups, support us by going to pintswithaquinas.com/give, and there you can support us on Locals or Patreon. You help this thing keep going.
And that link's in the description too.
That link is in the description. But before we do anything else, I want to tell people about Hallow. You know what Hallow is?
I don't actually.
Hallow is
Tell me.
It's a really excellent prayer and meditation app for Catholics.
Okay.
That they have invested a ton of money into, and it's as good as it gets. I'll show it to you in a sec.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, they have something special for this upcoming Lent. They have Jim Caviezel and Jonathan Rumi, who are the two people most famous for their portrayals of Jesus, leading people in daily meditations throughout Lent. So there is a cornucopia. I've used that word more than once today. There is a lot of things available to y'all if you want to kind of grow in your faith life. And Hallow is one way to do that. Hallow.com/MattFrad. Hallow.com/MattFrad. And also they have a charity component where they'll donate $1 to Cross Catholic Outreach for each of the first 100,000 participants in the Pray 40 Challenge. It's hashtag Pray 40 Challenge. The $100,000 in funds will go towards building 24 wells to provide a lifetime of clean water to 4,000 people. Their goal is to get 150,000 people praying this year for Lent. So hallow.com/MattFrad. Just play around with it. Since you asked what it is, you're familiar with
in the world. So then in the world of, and this is not a planned thing. Like we didn't put this bit in. But then at the level of banter while I'm looking at it,
doesn't it look just beautiful?
No, it's very well. Wow, it's very well put together. And
the guy used to be into Buddhism and New Age stuff and centering prayer and became a sort of Catholic after that. And so the apps he used to meditate before that he realized were problematic, he decided to create one for Catholics. It's unbelievable.
Oh, wow. This is really
And I actually use sleep stories for my kids at night on that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Matt has one too on that.
I have one too. So if you want to never sleep again, you can listen to me whisper to you the Song of Songs.
Yeah, and then here's all
your neck is like I just play that in the background to get my wife in the mood. Your neck is like an the Tower of David. But man, this is good.
So before we get into the weighty stuff, y'all. I mean, I'm a huge supporter of the second person plural. Is that's
no. My wife is from Texas. When I first moved to America, I moved to Texas, so I guess she says it. Her family says it. So I've just adopted that.
Did you have in Australia a second person plural?
No, I don't think so.
No, so you.
Just you guys.
You guys.
Use,
okay.
You. I don't know.
So, yeah, would you use?
No.
No. Okay.
Do you?
No, technically around here, yins would be the thing to say,
yins.
Right?
Yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah,
as I say, because they'll refer to people from Pittsburgh as yinsers. And it's a strange Scots-Irish thing of you ones is what it's kind of contracting. No, we didn't grow up with that. And the teachers were always, don't say that. And so all of you is what I do.
Y'all.
But my
y'all.
wife's
That's my
family
favorite.
is all yins, all y'all.
All y'all.
It's like
all y'all.
Really all of you.
Really. Oh, man, fantastic.
But anyway.
And one more thing before we get going to those who are watching live. Hey, we just hit over 200,000. And even today, we're over 201,000 subscribers. So that's an extra, 1,000 at least? Yep. Crazy. So thank you for subscribing if you haven't already. If you want to, now's your chance. I mean, there will come a day where YouTube will turn on all of us Christians. Now's your chance to subscribe. You may not get another chance.
Before we leave the topic of y'all, I recently noticed myself sending in a message, y'all all. So I'm a fan of that.
Y'all all.
Y'all all. Yeah, which is along the same lines of that. All y'all.
And just to get nerdy about it, I think it's really interesting to have that, like you said, the second person, like collective, distinct from just.
Yes.
The technical is you're supposed to say you for a group.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I think it's as a translator, I run into it, of course, all the time, right? In French and Latin, it's still there. You have a plural of your second person, of you all. And so in a sense, the good culture that they tried to get us out of our redneck culture where I grew up was really ruining me. I should have been taught yins. Yins is more cultured. So it's like tip of the hat to my in-laws.
You're a super bright guy who obviously is very academically leaning. What do you do for fun other than this stuff?
Well, and I've already mentioned the one this time of year is like skiing.
Sure.
Yeah, that was my dear old grandfather who used it as his self-treatment for rheumatoid arthritis.
Unreal.
He is. I mean, that's where
I wouldn't have thought the cold would help.
Yeah, but he was very active. He had played like pickup basketball, and in his late 40s, early 50s, he was diagnosed. So he had to stop doing that because it was too hard on his joints.
So what else do you do? Skiing, what else?
But so anyway, yeah, sorry. It's just he's such a cool guy, like that fact. Sorry. I'll just go down there.
No, it's okay. I don't care about him. Keep going.
I care about him because I owe out of a debt of filial piety to Joe Jurega. Pray for him, people. No, anyway. No, so Yeah, what else do I do? I love doing the house projects.
Do you?
Yeah, really. I've had to become quite
My
handy.
wife would be jealous
now,
your wife.
The past year has been miserable stuff in my crawl space because I had termite damage. I mean, I had to have professionals do some of it, but all these sorts of things. We've torn up floors and all that sort of thing.
That's your downtime. That's what you do.
After my stepfather died, I built a new counter. Butcher block thing and all this. I had to have a little bit of help.
It makes sense if you're up in your head all the time thinking about these things. You want to do something.
And I said I had to do this to just kind of keep myself busy after all the stress of the end of his life and caring for him, to have something to do. Gardening. I run. We do a bit of kayaking, but it's not intense. It's more like fishing, kayaking.
Nice.
So yeah, all these sorts of things.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's not all intellectual stuff all the time.
Good.
That's terrible for the soul.
You go insane, yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a ton of questions from our gorgeous and intelligent supporters on Patreon and Locals that I want to get to in a second.
How about your non-gorgeous supporters?
No, all of them become gorgeous when they start giving. It's actually a really great way to get in shape and for your skin to clear up.
So please go to patreon.com/MattFrad
or Locals. Yeah, all right. So I want to ask those questions, but I want to remind people too that this Thursday I am hosting a debate. This is the debate this is probably the second debate as far as what I'm excited about. When we had Trent Horn debating that English atheist dude, Cosmic Skeptic, I was really excited about that. But I'm really excited about this debate on young Earth creationism between two Catholics. Also, it looks like we have a debate coming up on the SSPX.
Oh.
One of them's arguing they're schismatic.
Oh,
I don't think that.
Yeah.
But I look forward to hearing.
Yeah, so I don't hold them to be schismatic, but sometimes in my wryness, I refer to the FSSP as the SSPX uniates, which is a kind of. So for those of you who don't know, uniate is sort of a negative term that often the Orthodox use for Eastern Catholics.
That's right.
They went back into union.
But there's also SSP5 who are legit sedevacantists.
Yes.
So maybe the SSPX are the uniates.
But they were first is the problem. You need to have the away and then back. The away then back.
I see. That's what you mean.
Yeah.
So anyway, that debate is on Thursday. So I'm really looking forward to it. People should subscribe, check that stuff out. Hey, let's talk about something far less lofty. What are they called? The 3 what of the moral act? The intention,
the 3 sources of the moral
act. Let's talk about this because it is fascinating.
It comes up all the it comes up all the time. It's like funny. You read the Catechism, right? It's like reading right out of the Treatise on Human Acts in St. Thomas. Well, that's the Dominicans who helped pen that.
Right. So you have. Let's do this. You have the object. You have the circumstances into which the moral act is placed, if you want, and you have the intention of the acting subject. All right, so that's the object, which is the act the will chooses, the circumstances surrounding the act, and the intention of the actor, of the acting subject. Correct me if I'm wrong at any point.
Correct.
But if at any 3, if a moral act is to be considered good, all 3 sources must be good. Right. So an example I like to use is I don't like to use it all the time, but here's one. Suppose you and I went and got coffee after this because we've only had 800 espressos this morning, and we see a homeless man on the side of the road, and I give him money. That's a good object. And if the circumstances are good, that is to say he eats that day, doesn't use them for...
That you can foresee.
Yeah, that I can foresee. That's right. But suppose my primary intention is for you to think I'm a swell guy.
Yeah.
Right. It comes out of pride. I think most people would say that's not good what you did.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So
then let's flip it. So that's an evil.
That's an evil intention. Let's do an evil circumstance.
Let's do an evil object first because this is where you can.
But that's what we're going to get to. That's going to be the big bulk of the discussion.
Yeah, it is.
So can we quickly go through circumstance?
No, that's fine. I am watching my mind because I do this a little bit differently than Thomists, but good Thomists say I'm safe, but I have to be careful. So yeah, evil circumstances.
Is that okay?
No, please.
All right. So here's an example. You can tell me if you can think of a better example.
Well, you can tweak circumstances in all kinds of fun ways.
Yeah. So let's say a man makes love to his wife. This is a good object, and he does so out of love for her, but he does so perhaps unbeknownst to him when it's medically dangerous.
The unbeknownst to him is a problem.
That is a problem.
Yeah, because
I don't know how to make the intention good if he knows it's medically dangerous. So maybe you give us an example then.
Yeah, so we stay on that example, which is probably best, right? It's always better not to venture too far off if you don't have something immediately prepared. Sure. So yeah, it could be all other things equal. It would have been fine. Let's say that he knew that would be there's a potential effect. That's fine. Because effect is a circumstance.
Yeah.
So, because all the circumstances, so to be clear for those who kind of get like mystified by this, it's just a non-essential aspect of the act, right? The object of the act is not so much the thing that you're choosing, it's what is essential. Ultimately, it's actually going to describe an act of a given virtue, right? Is this, whatever virtue this is. I mean, I'm making up a name, but Aristotle says there are many unnamed virtues. Sexual love in a spousal way. Right? That's our object that we're looking for here. One of the effects of this act, which is not essential to that, but it's an effect.
A consequence would be another example.
Exactly.
Or another name for that.
Exact consequence or effect. Exactly. Is that you put her at significant risk. So let's say that you've had multiple cesarean sections.
There you go.
And you've just had another child. And so, maybe the doctors are a little bit conservative here. We've had this experience, my wife and I, where you feel like they're telling you to wait forever. Because every doctor, it's like, even if they're Catholic, thinks everyone's contracepting, but let's say within bounds, that you should be following your doctor, it's a couple weeks after, no, not a couple weeks, but whatever, certain period after, and you could put your wife at risk. There was a great deal of danger in the last operation, but the doctor said it was a fluke, but you need to really recover before you decide to have another child, because it's going to be another cesarean. So because of how traumatic this one was, you need to wait.
So I'm not sure if this is going to work with that thrown in. Because what I'm trying to show is
the intention can be a kind of spousal love, like that doesn't come out of a lust.
All right.
Really, it doesn't have to come out of a kind of lustfulness as your intention.
Okay, so the point is the circumstances surrounding this lovemaking could make the act something less than good.
It changes the object. It makes it's not just less good. If you put your wife at risk, all of a sudden...
Well, that's why I was concerned that you're changing the intention.
You're not changing let's say the intention. Let's leave the intention at the level of...
No one knows what we're doing right now.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, this is hard. So, okay, what you're sensing is the fact that actually the circumstances are hard to define because circumstances sometimes are actually reflective of a property of the object of the act. And sometimes you look at a circumstance and you realize, the object of that act was actually, sexual, immeasured or like unchaste sexuality of a kind. It's not necessarily coming out of a lust, but it's unchaste in the sense that sexuality should be ensconced within relationships, one of which is not putting my wife in danger. It doesn't have to come out of roaring lust.
That perverts the intention, however you do it.
You've done what I want to do. See, this is why, this way of presenting this is not how I present it.
Okay.
No, you got to be very...
Well, let me ask you real quick before, and then I'll let you go. But give us an example of a human act...
okay.
In which the object is good, the intentions are good, but the circumstances are evil.
Yeah, you're probably going to say the same thing, and it's great because it makes the point. It makes me feel like I can sink down into this essay I just wrote for this conscious book.
All right,
I'm like, okay, all that I've been doing for years that's been seen as quirky is correct. It's correct, and it's correct in a sense. So let's think of generosity, not merely to someone on the street, but like friends who, young couple that could use some money. And you get, somewhat unthinkingly, you just intend to help them out. And this is really not coming out of at least premeditated intention, that you didn't set out thinking this. I want to make sure that like either everyone sees me giving to them or, which is akin to what you said before, or even I want to set out and be like, and just be flippant about where I give it to them. I don't care how shamed they are. You don't set out like that. You're just, I want to help them out, right? But in the course of whatever, your interactions with them, you're in public with other friends, and you do it in a way that in the actual execution of the act, the actual doing of the act, you do in a way that's culpable. Like you should have known better. Because that's what's key here, right? If you accidentally did it and it was a kind of just absent-mindedness that really was not malicious, it gets harder and harder to figure out whether or not you're culpable. I just go to confession with that and just confess it and say, voluntary or involuntary sin as an Easterner.
Yeah.
But, okay, you give it to them in a way that is kind of embarrassing. You give it to them, someone sees it, who shouldn't have seen them receiving the money because it's embarrassing.
Yeah,
they're trying to...
That's the problem, though,
you infringe you infringe their...
Okay.
So no, because
what I'm upset about, and what your point, and I'm going to prove your point, you're going to feel terrific again, is that you're messing with the intention again.
Because you know why you're doing this. So everything is downstream of the intention. Because when you were at Holy Apostles, so we got to be real careful here because we're going to get in the weeds, folks. So those of you who it's like, we were in the heights, now we're in the weeds.
All right.
But what I joke with some people about, did you do the 12 steps of a good act?
No.
Yeah, there's this chart that goes around. It kind of hardened in the later Thomists, and it became a real normal way to teach Thomas's moral psychology. How does practical reason, how does prudence get to its activity? So, right, there's a distinction between this is good stuff, this is correct stuff. But you can, if you're worried about relativism, just let me know and I'll explain.
Okay.
But moral truth is different than speculative truth, than truth just about things. Because like when we want to say how the world is, how reality is, for everything from metaphysics to biology to mathematics to physics, right? It's just about are my judgments matching up with reality, either directly or through reasoning. But moral truth, practical truth, prudential truth is about whether or not did I, with all of my character, live up to virtuous ends. You can't understand the practice of prudence. This is very important, actually. People tend to think of moral reasoning, prudence, and conscience, whatever we want to call it, as though there are the moral rules, there are the moral laws. Sometimes you might call them,
That's right.
sometimes you might call them virtues.
Yeah.
But I got to kind of like apply that in my circumstances.
Yep.
Like, this is how sometimes people then mess with it. Well, the ideal can't really apply, is how then the laxist will say here.
Justify
right?
contraception.
Exactly. Well, contraception, yes, there's a moral norm against it, but in my circumstances, it doesn't apply. Well, okay, that's a horrible use of this idea of a kind of universal law of particular actions. You need to look within, this is Veritatis Splendor language from it, to look from the perspective of the acting subject, the acting agent, and consider what it is like to get to a choice. And as you know, prudence, choices of means. And remember, means does not mean what are the means to, like, I kind of have a goal and I want to get there. The choosing and doing of the means of a moral action is making my own this moral action. It's a real conquest of morality. But you can't talk about means unless you have what is the cause of the being of the means. I meant to be that abstract. The end. You need ends. Even if it's just incipient, even if you're just developing your character, you have to have some intention.
Yes.
You have to have some beginning of the act where you're
100%.
I'm seeking to do. So we're going to let's stick with this example because it's so abstract.
And just to be real clear, Aquinas would say that a moral act and a human act, he would use those terms, or we would use those terms synonymously. Yeah. So that if there is no intention, such as me snoring while I'm asleep, this isn't a human or moral act.
Yeah.
So even if I scratch instinctively, this isn't a moral act. I have to be intending something for it.
So now because of what you're feeling, you're absolutely right. So let's before we then kind of pull the chart apart and explain the steps. Right here, what you're feeling is though intention, object, circumstances. We laid these out as like these neat little things. Yeah. You can't talk about an object without talking about what intention laid behind it or what failure.
Because I can do a good thing. The object can be good, but I can be committing evil. Yeah, and the whole act, and really the way to see it is, this is where I think it gets people in trouble. So the object could look good, like where I'm just giving the money, I'm giving alms out of pride is a normal example. Sort of like how we were talking about with the guy on the street. I'm giving alms out of a kind of pride. I don't like describing it like that. Through and through, you know what the object of that act is? Pride. Just happens to be that it was giving of alms. Because the object of the act is what you did. Do you see how people tend to mistreat this? Now, there's a real danger that's going to be here. So the object in that circumstance isn't giving alms. Exactly, because the object derives its moral character from the intention. Exactly. Giving alms is the circumstance. It's a kind of circumstance to what's essential. Now, we're going to have to be real careful. Like at the end of this, for technical reasons, the danger of this presentation is you put so much on the intention that people who are too kind of drunken sailors with it will justify evil choices by good intentions. They'll say, just do your conscience, doesn't matter. So let's just remember that, but we'll come back to that to make sure that because we need to address it. Because I'm going to lean into the intention with very good backing on this, though. Cajetan makes the point, and Thomas basically does too in his text, but you don't see it as clearly, that the intention is the primary source of the morality of the act. Even so much so, because it's weird. If you look at the old charts of the circumstances, the end is a circumstance. Okay.
But it's weird because it's a separate source of morality. So the Thomists, so Cajetan writes his commentary, very close commentary in the 15th, 16th century on the Summa, and he's like, scratches his head. He's like, well, why? He doesn't actually scratch his head. He says, here's why it is. But he asks the question, why is the end listed among the circumstances, but also is the separate? It's the intention, right? Well, it's because that end is particularly powerful in giving the object its actual character. Like it's the most important of the circumstances, so much so that it sometimes does things that circumstances, it very often does things that circumstances don't do. Because when you define, this is Father Pincare's, of course, in a sense, is really driving this home in certain texts of his. When you describe the object of an act, you really want to ask yourself, this is what I teach my students all the time, what virtue or vice is it reflecting? And as soon as you do that, the virtues and vices drive the first steps of moral reasoning, intention. So we've got 4 things on our little chart. And this is important, even though it's going to seem like a lot of details. Sometimes when we reason about things, when you're like watching a movie, for example, and you see something like wow, that's inspiring, like that, you get a moral truth while watching a movie. You really appreciate it. There's a kind of judgment we can have there, and a kind of willing we can take. We can like rejoice in something that's really good. Stories do this for us. We see this in examples of other people who we take to be good. This is called by St. Thomas, at least, simple willing, because it's not really about what I'm going to do right now. It's just a kind of good pleasure in a good that's not to be accomplished. Sometimes people present this as though it's a kind of like, it would be nice if I could live forever, but it's so much deeper than that. It's like the source of our moral life. If you can't see the intrinsic goodness of something, at least in a teeny, teeny, teeny bit, like with a weak little bit, you've not converted yourself to the virtue. But then, of course, the next step is, in my circumstances, so think of the friend to give money to, in my circumstances, broadly speaking, I've decided, I should help them. It's fine. I got the flexibility. They said something to me recently. I have a real sense no one's, they're not getting a lot of help. I should do that. So I have set myself in a kind of very abstract way. I've not even thought through the details yet to help them. I don't even know if it's going to be through money or if it's going to be through offering to help them when the kid comes along or whatever, but I've started to internalize, I've made my own that end of the moral virtue. Sometimes this is very difficult if you're not very strong in it. Maybe your spiritual father told you need to do this because you got to grow in that virtue. But that intention is necessary in order to now have the next step of then choosing or doing the act. And so you reflect. So now we're on the second major part of the table, which is where you have to choose what you're going to do. So we're still far away from giving the money. We reflect on it. We ask others, maybe. Sometimes hard choices, you have to talk to people. You have to be docile to your spiritual father, to relatives, to people who know you, to people who just, people you trust. So like at the end of my stepfather's life, we had it ended up being clear, thank God, but a real hard end of life nutrition, hydration question. Because part of it was the doctor was thinking I was like every other American who wanted to try everything. And I had to really try and see what is his state, because I don't want to not give him nutrition and hydration when it's appropriate. So I called all sorts of folks that I know. I'm very blessed that I can call. It's like lay theologians, lay philosophers, monks, nuns, like priests. It's all across the board. You do that. That's the stage of what would be called deliberation or counsel. You deliberate within yourself. You consider the circumstances. You, in general, consider all the various paths you can take, and you have to have a good character, right? Because if you're not virtuous, we're right now in the virtue of prudence. This is where prudence is working. If you lack prudence or some of those virtues that help prudence along, I have a huge chart that I have of this. Thomas has all these ones broken out. It's huge. They're like 15, 20 virtues attached to prudence. If you just too flippantly don't listen to other people, or you're too quick and you're just like, I'll just do this. And then, they don't really need money. They need help, watching their kids afterwards. And that's really all they need. You fail in your counseling, conciliare tarde, take counsel slowly. But then you eventually, of course, have to get off the pot. Right. And you have to judge what you're going to do. So judgment and choice brings this stage to an end. But that's not the whole story of prudence then, right? So up to this point, actually, we're constituting, we're making the object of our act descend down into the particularities of our circumstances. That's what's happening, right? Liberality, generosity is vitally descending because I have the character to not mess up, because I could have messed up to this point. So let's mess it up first and then get to our case, because our case is way at the end. I could decide that I'm going to, like I said, I'm gonna help them with their kids, and they actually do need money for things. So then I make the choice, because I precisely just was not even thinking about them enough. It was really culpable. I mean, I could have thought it through. I then go and offer this to them. You could say the object of the act is offering them help, but flippantly. And so it's like a kind of like circumstance that makes it bad. So there you go, right? You see? But your itch that like, you're like, you messed up the intention. Yeah. Making the wrong decision, giving them the help that they don't need precisely because you didn't think it through and consider your friend well enough. It's a way of failing in a good intention. The good intention, it's like the virtue begins, the virtue wants to flower in an act. It has to do it through the exercise of prudence. So the end has to come into being, and then it fails. And guess what? You emit. They always say this in Latin. You do. It comes forth from you. An act that's actually opposed to the virtue. It's an act of a vice, at least the beginning of a vice.
Opposed to it, or
it's opposed to it,
or sort of parallel and not.
It's not merely an imperfection. Sorry, go on.
Well, I'm just thinking if my friend needs help and I choose to help him with his kids instead of giving money, I'm still doing a good that he appreciates.
Well, let's say it's something
it may just not be exactly what he needs.
If it's something he doesn't need, and it's quite flippant on your part. This is where a spiritual father helps you distinguish between a merely imperfect act, which you do have to be very careful about. An imperfect act is just a lesser good.
There you go. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you really don't want to. You don't want to confuse a lesser good with an evil. Right. There's a beautiful chapter on this, and I think
that's a great way to go insane.
It is. It's a way to become scrupulous.
Yes.
It is a way to become insanely scrupulous, because virtue is not achieved all at once. So, this is the whole world that some of the theologians call a remiss act.
Just so we can back up for my own edification here, you're basically saying when we look at the three sources of a moral act, you can't have a good object unless you have a good intention.
Exactly.
So it's not possible to do an act in which I have good object, evil circumstances, evil intention.
Now, sometimes people have intention is they understand that as like what you tell yourself you're doing. So we'll talk about that when we deal with the intending something good but doing something evil. We'll talk about that there. But you can't really have a good object unless your intention is good. And the object is best described as the flowering of the virtue that is the source of the intention.
Say that line again.
Yep. The object of the act, because it's what you did. It's in a sense most important because it's what you did.
Yeah.
The best description of it is not merely giving money. Because people tend to say give alms, but alms already is kind of good. Giving money is not a very rich moral description, right? But liberality, an act of liberality toward your friend, the best description came from the virtue, which comes from the intention that was the source of that action. Because you can't have the means, prudence, without the end. Of course, we haven't even finished prudence though, because let's just presume that we've chosen to do the right thing for our friend. The actual perfection of prudence is not merely choosing to do it, it is doing it. Prudence.
Oh, I see. Not choosing to do it, but actually acting.
Too many Thomists sometimes talk as though the choice is where it all ends. But I mean, Thomas himself is clear on this, and the best Thomists are very clear too. Command is the primary act of prudence, because you have to actually do it.
So if I decide to give money to my friend, but
then I can just not do it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a sense in which when you go to confess it, it's a lesser evil. Because at least you chose to do it. I mean, I know, all things equal, that seems maybe a little bit lighthearted, but, it's not as bad as being so selfish that you didn't do it. You know what I mean? But you have to do it.
Choose to do something and not do it. Wouldn't that just be choosing not to do it?
No, but if I actually choose to say, let's say you need $20 or else you're going to get kicked out of your apartment, and I choose to do it, I mean that I'm going to do it. But I don't actually do it because I forgot or I'm lazy.
Culpably forgot. Like you just let yourself
other
get
things
distracted.
that were less important supersede that.
Yeah, I mean, there may be some secondary act that's back in there of you then choosing to not pay attention, to dither about on the internet when you know that it's going to make you forget, or something. But that act that we're describing, like this idea of being a good friend who pays attention to another friend's needs and in these circumstances giving it, you all of a sudden, I would go to confession for that. I'd go to confession for that. I wouldn't be scrupulous. Hand it over. It's a minor sin. It's venial, but hand it over. I mean, all things based on that example, I presume would be venial.
So this is, and so
when you go to do, I'm so sorry.
No, you're
Matt.
fine, mate.
I talk over people all the time, but this is I get really excited about this, and I've got this really technical book coming out on it. So because as you're doing the act too, you still have to like avoid certain evils. Like you choose to do it, but there's still like the moral ability. Anyone who has like family filled with the people who don't believe, for example, knows like you're always trying to know how to have the right turn of phrase to not to not lead people into a kind of scandal or something else, right? Yeah. Or you don't know the details of what it's going to be like when you give the money. And let's just say all things equal, up to this point, it just made sense. You don't see them all that often. You only see them once a week or something, and it's in public. So you're going to have to do it in that venue, right? You still have to have an eye. This is actually why Thomas says there's special virtues in this step: caution, foresight, which is weird because you'd think foresight's earlier. There's a kind of foresight you have when you're counseling, but even as you're doing something, you're like, oh, shouldn't do that because that's going to be, that's going to be really, that's going to be insulting to them or something. I can see how that would be insulting. That's actually something that helps you when you're executing the act. So the command has to kind of spread out. So then you give the money to them, and I mean, maybe it's, I don't know, you're out with friends, you go out to eat and you're at the bar and you have a couple drinks and, you're just, you know that you're just a bit tipsy. Presume you're getting an Uber and you're also not drunk. So we're not introducing new other problems into this moral act. And you should know better. Like, okay, I really better make sure that I just pull them aside to give them this money. And then in like kind of the gregarious bigness of a personality like mine, you just do it. I mean, you're not intending to be like, I don't care how they get it. I just, I'm going to give it to them publicly, whatever. You just kind of failed while you did it. You did it in a way that's insulting to them. I would say that you have room there to consider it a sinful act because of a circumstance. You really do. Because if it's significantly hard to them, like there's at least room there. And I mean, I don't think you have to become scrupulous about this and think that it's some mortal sin, right? Because this is so minor. There's all the good intention that makes it better, or less bad, I should say, makes it less bad. There's all the choice that makes it less bad, but it's a flippant act of giving. I don't know, that's what I'm going to call it, because that's a way of opposing it to the virtue of liberality. I'm saying that, I set out to do the good that I want to do, and I do evil instead. I did something that was opposed to the virtue because the virtue really requires all the circumstances to be right. Earlier when I talked about liberality, I was very much echoing how Aristotle even says, to give money out of your excess to others in a way that is appropriate in the circumstances that are appropriate. He says it like that, because you failed then if you didn't do all that. You failed. You failed at the very tail end. You failed in the order of command. This is where all the distinctions really help.
Okay, sum up for me then how my going about this was less than perfect.
Yep. So we started with the intention.
Yep.
So we started with the judgment that, hey, it's good to be generous to friends, and now the intention judgment and intention of my will to do an act of liberality because my friend needs it. I descended from the order of intention to prudence. Conscience is now operative. I decided, after very careful and what seems to be enough on my own self-reflection, I sufficiently considered what I could do, and I chose to do it. So it's as much as I could do. I'm not guilty for not considering other things. At this point, I've chosen a good act to do. But then when I do it, in the midst of the actual circumstances, in a way that I am culpable for, I don't just fly.
Bloody fly.
I have done an act. I've chosen to do something that's really an embarrassment to them that I should have known. That all makes
sense to me.
And therefore, that object is in my mind, you don't want to call that object anything more than something that's opposed to the vice. The object itself is bad in that case.
Yes, I see.
Because you ask yourself,
right.
And then object and circumstance becomes very useful because first of all, object is what you chose. So it does distinguish it from the intention. So you do need to keep it as two separate things, two separate stages. But the object is what is most essential. And what is most essential here, because it's what you're going to go to confession for, is that I flippantly gave money, whatever. Sometimes I do this. It's like poor priests I go to. I'll say, sinned against the virtue of liberality. It's whatever we call it. I fell short of the virtue of liberality. Then the circumstances come in as, for instance, how embarrassing it was to them. What was the amount of money? What's your relationship to them? That's the kind of stuff we all do when we start to be like, well, it's not that bad. It wasn't that embarrassing. But you keep telling yourself, but I feel in my heart, and maybe I'm being scrupulous, maybe not. This is the mystery of it. This is where it's hard to reflect on your conscience. But, I do really think that I was wrong, essentially, because the object of the act was illiberality of a sort.
Right.
But the circumstances mitigate it and make it less bad. So it wasn't really that embarrassing, but it was. And I should just I should confess it among my venial sins. So then you see how the circumstances then tweak the goodness and badness of the object.
Right.
Always, though, the circumstances either make a good object more or less good, or an evil object more or less evil.
So the intention is intertwined with the object in a way that the circumstances aren't.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, yes, correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes, you can get into a world where we should not go here. I assure you, really, we shouldn't. The circumstances can generate secondary descriptions of the act.
Okay.
And this is where like the scholastics will say that you can have more than one moral species for an act, because this is the weird thing. Like an act can have multiple essential descriptions.
Gotcha.
But we just
let's not go there.
Yeah. Now let's use an example though where we have a good intention. Let's use contraception.
Yeah.
Right. So we have to just presuppose the basics of the argument, whether based on apostolic tradition or upon natural law for contraception. And I think on the whole, your audience is at least going to be there.
Yeah.
And if you're an interlocutor who just comes for the sake of arguing, we're taking this as a given, the objective evil of contraception. It's like, in a sense, any vice is objectively evil, right? Now the question becomes, okay, well, what do those acts look like? Well, so let's stay for now too at the level of condoms or the use of oral contraceptives.
Okay.
Right. Because then there's that whole harried issue of like, can you use NFP in a contraceptive manner?
Sure.
Let's just not, just
bracket that.
It's like it's like bracket. So it is a virtuous thing in the case of, for instance, the wife who could be at physical danger to space births in a way that doesn't, cause her to become pregnant and have her innards spill out. So there's what is the expression that I think Pius XII even uses it in that midwives address, and then also Paul VI, something like virtuous parenthood, but it's not that. But virtuous sexuality, virtuous spacing is part of chaste sexuality. It's part of it. So I intend the health of I don't merely intend the health of my wife, right? 'Cause that's another thing too. Let's back up for a second. Let's imagine a perverse world of how to misunderstand the point we're about to make. I intend the health of my wife, but I chose to have sex that put her in danger. Like everything else that's equal, we don't even contracept here at this point. I mean, you're not having sexual relations with your wife for her health, right? It's like you're telling yourself that's not how you should think about intention. Like, it's so weird. Like, when you do the act, the intention of that act is not the health of your wife. The intention is sexual intercourse of some sort, right? Okay, now though, let's back up. So I intend in a very general sense, though, that informs many of my acts that I will not put my wife's health at danger, for instance, among our sexual acts. So then that intention floating around in the back of my moral agency, which is a good character trait that should be there, and it's not merely a self-deceived story that I tell myself, at least not yet, then comes into conflict here with this case. I've had a couple kids, as men to men, you're now like 5 months into after pregnancy and you can't have relations with your wife. For a number of people, this would be difficult. And so you decide, well, I'm going to use a condom, but I intend the health of my spouse, and that intention for the health of my spouse is really like, the kind of whatever it's called in the papal documents. This is wrong, but this is what someone's trying to convince themselves of, chaste sexual intercourse, because I'm not intending this for the whole of our sexual life, and I'm trying to space the birds in a way that doesn't put her health in danger. So I'm going to choose to perform contracepted sexual intercourse. That's the act you're choosing to do, right? So the story some people would want to tell there is, okay, yeah, but I'm thinking of how I've seen that they teach this still among the people at the Gregorianum. The transcendental norm is a kind of chaste love of my spouse, but my categorical norm is it's such washed over Kantianism is the contracepted act. But I haven't spurned the Church's teaching of contraception, right. And I haven't, I'm bearing in mind the moral law to recognize in my sexuality my wife's health. Right, her safety. You do have to ask yourself at a certain point, though, what did you do? Mm-hmm. This is where when people insist on the object being central, they're right, because the object is going to tell you the very act you did. But the deep story that's there, you started out with intending something good, the health of your spouse, and this is what we've been doing for multiple months, etc. Yeah. And that's sort of been the background intention. But then some point where like we could call it like the proximate intention, like right when the the evening that you're going to have intercourse, you intended that same chaste sexuality, but almost immediately you made this choice that is out of line with it. Mm-hmm. And so no longer does that intention doesn't hold in that object. Because if you think of the intention as the deep moral source, what did it emanate from? That act emanated from, it came forth from, ultimately a kind of incipient unchastity, right? That this is an act of unchastity. So, no matter what you may tell yourself, maybe on some level, so this is where when some people talk about the intention, it becomes a kind of circumstance to the act, actually, that can make it less bad. I wasn't doing this because I was just utterly lustful. I mean, I was doing it out of a kind of fear for my wife's safety. That's how most people think of the word intention, right? I intended her safety. Well, that does, in a sense, make it less bad than all other things equal, an act that's just pure lust. But there's, in that very tight analysis of how did this act happen, whatever I might have intended very, very early on about chaste sexuality, very quickly it fell apart.
And that's not what I'm
really,
intending.
In a sense,
now.
you probably even didn't make much of a choice. As soon as you made that choice, your intention changed pretty early on. I'm just intending to have sex, but it's in this way that uses a condom. Yes, temporarily. That's illy. The adverb words, those are good for a circumstance of quality, is what I tell my students.
Say that again.
Quickly, any adverb word. Yeah. It's usually when you're describing a word. I did quickly, readily, happily, speedily, etc. Yeah. All of those are in quality, the quality of the act. So temporarily, I'm contracepting. Yeah. Okay, well, that makes it less bad. But the act structure, what does it come forth from? What does it ultimately come forth from? By a kind of moral failing, it comes forth from the vice. But here, notice how your viewers only partially can see this. I've got like the 3 sections here. We're very high in the chart. The intention structure falls apart very quickly, whereas that example of our friends, it all kind of fell apart at the end. The intention was there. I chose the intention is still there. I'm doing it. The intention is still there. And then all of a sudden I failed. And then, it's kind of like, it's a much weaker failure. But here you're pretty high up. I mean, you have decided pretty quickly to just intend non-chaste sexuality. Yeah. And so you see how the intention in that strict sense is actually bad. But a kind of remote intention, the intention you tell yourselves, if you maybe remember this from your courses, because some professors really focus on this, the Finis Operantis, the end that you've told yourself is your end, but not the end of your act. The end of your act is what? The end of your act is contraceptive non-chaste sexual intercourse. But the story you tell yourself, which is not unimportant as a kind of circumstance, makes it less bad, makes it less evil. Yeah.
So just to, I guess, point of clarification to ask about. So you're saying that this inherent evil, essentially, if I'm understanding right, it basically won't happen unless the original intent is perverse in the first place, right?
Well, no, because like, for instance, think about that example from the Friends. That inherent evil came at the very last minute when you had to ask about what was the act of giving the money. It was a kind of illiberality. So the intention was actually to be liberal, to be generous. The intention was like that for a long time. Like really, like my soul was animated by that virtue as I deliberated about what I should do, very carefully considering them, as I chose what to do to give them whatever funds. And then in the midst of the execution of the act, all of a sudden, I just fail in that intention. And there you see that it's more like a failure of the intention when it's that late in the process. Like I gave money in a way that's not liberal. It doesn't matter how generous it might look. The moral character of that act is a sin because I did it in a way that is unbecoming. Now you have to discern this so you don't become some scrupulous mess. But do you see how like there, the intention, it's more like, this is maybe the weakness of my position. You've almost stepped outside of the intention at the very last minute. You failed the intention that has gone this far. And so it's like, what is the real object? This is where you don't even pay much attention to the intention anymore. You just say, what's the object of the act? It's illiberality. But that ultimately comes from a kind of vice that your end became, at the last minute, your end switched from being liberality to illiberality.
So the person intended illiberality?
No, it's more like it's you failed at that liberal intention. And so now at the best, I mean, it was liberality was involved the whole time, but the object of the act in the end was not liberal. So the intention failed. And so the end of the act itself, which is mostly reflected in the object, is illiberality. So you see how, like, I mean, I'm saying the intention is really important here, but in these cases, especially in execution, the very last sorts of steps of the doing of the act, which is quite important though, it's more, you need to think of it more like I'm stepping outside of the intention. Whereas the example we used of the couple is probably, you really could describe the act of that couple as, after some deliberation, you kind of start back over and you really did intended unchaste sexual intercourse. No matter what you may tell yourself about it, you intended, that.
So I guess two parts to the question now then. The first one would be...
this is fine. This is good for me.
It seems to me that there's a kind of... You can have more than one intention behind, in the giving example specifically. The way that I would understand that is I would say that the person intended to be, generous and liberal and helpful. And then the person, in the heat of the moment, they have an added intention of just, some carelessness or some lack of consideration about a situation. And so because they're doing that, there's the action and object of that too. But then the whole action now isn't branded as this, it's either stamp of approval or stamp of, sin, I guess.
Yeah.
It could be that the action of the giving, it has a twofold part to it. One of them is that they gave money, and then the sin is that the circumstance was wrong.
And you could, and these intentions are quite nested. I mean, this is like the whole point of Elizabeth Anscombe's book on intention, is it's always these multiple nestings like this. And so what you're doing is just sort of like a complex act. Like I'm leaving it in sort of a kind of simple act where you just have intention, means, act. But really you have an intention which with inside itself in its doing has another intention with its act, which is often very true. I might just be more of a rigorist in my analysis. I'm like, is that really though? I mean, would I really want to call that an act of liberality? It is. You would say it'd be like liberality, but also carelessness of some sort. I think that you could recast the process in that way. Because then what you have is, and this is an example though of how I would look at it, that seeing it has a kind of intention that's in there is completely fine. That circumstance adds a moral species. So, it is still a pretty much generous act, but it adds the moral species, the moral description of carelessness as well. So I've got one act that has two different descriptors in the end, which is sort of what you're getting at.
Well, I would just call it two acts with two separate descriptors.
Okay, and I mean, one might do that. I mean, this is like we're at the pin of the needle a little bit here. How many angels on it? And I'm not saying you're wrong to ask it. Actually, I just want to make sure that I'm not pushing too much.
And then to go back to the original example, I guess basically I'm trying to connect here in my mind the idea of inherent evil acts.
Yep.
And then it seemed like when you gave the example of that, you said this inherently evil act happened, and then because this was in here, then the intention is bad. So my question, I guess, would be, could you have a situation like that without that inherent evil, where at the last minute there's a switch and a motivation of unchastity? In what way is that inherent evil linked to the intention, or is it?
The vocabulary of like moral goodness and evil is much more in the moral virtues and theological virtues too, but the moral virtues and not so much prudence, which is also a moral virtue as well as an intellectual virtue, because that's all the rich place of like, I can describe a virtue or a vice, right? So if you want to describe something that's inherently evil, you're going to always be backing up against something that is a vice. Rape, stealing, lying. Does not go down the lying path though, because I don't want to get in trouble with certain people. Contracepting, etc. Right? You're talking about a kind of vice language. So it's up in the world of the ends of virtues or vices. So you're trying to describe there are certain acts that where they happen, they have intrinsic evilness. So, murder is like this, right? It's kind of, we would say it's kind of easy to say, yeah, murder is intrinsically evil, right? But then we do find ourselves in this problematic place because killing's not the same thing as murder, because then you're going to have to deal with the self-defense and also going to war thing, right? So I tend to ask, when someone says about intrinsic evils, I'm like, okay, you have to keep asking yourself, what was the virtue that object came from? Like in the end, because that's like where the oomph of the moral vocabulary comes from. So it's like pornography. It's like you have to explain, we'll do it in more detail though. You have to be able to articulate why pornography is unchaste. You could also argue why pornography is an injustice to the people. It's part of a structure of injustices in a way that's essentially part of its nature. So it's okay now, come back. Yeah, because the problem here is
basically, I would say, is contraception wrong because it's inherently evil, or is it wrong because it has this intention inherent to it?
Well, it's wrong because it's inherently evil, but contraception is not merely the slapping, and I'm not being dismissive, it's more for the lightness. It's not merely the slapping of a condom on someone's penis or whatever, this pill as well. Actually, the pill would work with the example I give. It's not merely it's not even merely the taking of the pill, because you've got the problems of like people who have, for example, menorrhagia, and they bleed too much. And all things equal, considering that they're not going to be tempted to fall into lust in their teenage years, they start taking contraception for a while as young women. They start taking, it's like, notice what we have to watch for our vocabulary. They take cycle-changing drugs for the sake of them not bleeding all cycle, and being anemic and whatnot, right? But in order to call that act contraceptive in the way that we Catholics use it, it's an act that has the structure of not considering an essential component of sexuality to be the openness to life. And hence, and in my mind, that's a kind of unchastity. It's a sin against the very nature of chastity. So it comes from the domain of the moral virtues or vices in this case. And then in some way it's reflected in the order of intention, even if it's only that you failed along the way. You failed in a chaste intention. It's harder to do it in that case, but you pull out at the last minute, I guess, or something like that. That's an example of you failed in your chastity all of a sudden at the very end. The husband and spouse are, they really are trying to be doesn't make any sense actually. Never mind. Because the problem is if you've already started the act, you're already on your way there, right? Putting your wife at danger. But, so some acts and their objects are so obvious, like when you look at the object of the act, that it's just the object's intrinsically wrong, that you tend to just be like, yeah, because that chosen object is wrong. So it's like rape is like, I can't really imagine circumstances in which I look at, that sort of thing happening and saying, well, you got to understand that if you actually look at the act, you could figure out a way to see that this was some other intention in this. No, it's just like always that object is an injustice toward some person.
I don't want to bog down the conversation.
I'm sorry. This is very technical.
With my confusion, but it seems to me that you're just, all these things that I've heard explained as inherent evils, you're just saying they're inherently evil intentions. So I would just say that the evil of like rape is that rape would be an intent.
Well, and it comes first from
but this again is why we have to distinguish object and intention, that they are kind of accordioned into one term, correct?
Yes, correct. Yeah, because the object of rape gets all of its evil from the vice that is the intention that then lives in the object of the act. Because the object of the act is not I happen to, let's choose a different example for the sake of anyone who might have certain sensitivities that are quite understandable. It's just that that's such a malicious act. The object of the act is not merely all the details about how I stole. It's just what's the essential thing that happened here. And the essential thing was not merely because if the morality comes primarily, as the Catechism says, and then St. Thomas as well, the morality of the act comes essentially from its object. That's because it's what you did. That's why it's essentially in the object. Well, if what you did is just taking things, that's a neutral notion. So, that's like my novice master, they had to steal from a garden. They had to take from a garden while they were fleeing from the Nazis, right? Well, all things equal, there was not a stealing because the universal destination of goods, right? It was not stealing in that sense. So the descriptor stealing has to come from somewhere. So you can say it comes from the vices. So it doesn't always mean there's an intention up behind it, but it's a failure of the intention of virtue, and hence it's a kind of like implicitly, it's the vice coming forward, and the vice is coming from the ends of our actions into the object, though, in this case. But you do have to always ask yourself. It's like the sort of the caveat here, then, because the danger here is such leaning on intentions that if someone who's dangerous will justify evil acts based on good intentions, but you have to always ask yourself what you did. And so the object has to be described morally. And if what you did is evil, that's it. That part's evil. You're just going to say that reflects a vice. I don't care if you call it some failure of intention or not. That act in its character reflects a vice, and hence it's evil. So then the descriptions of intrinsic evils then become descriptions of certain vices. There are certain things that when they occur are always evil. Hence, I'll jump into the pit. Lying is always evil, but there are circumstances in which, like banter and joking, where is that actually lying? Because are you giving people a truth that is owed to them in that case? Okay, no. But if it was a case where you owed to someone else truthfulness, lying is intrinsically evil.
Oh, so you're not in line with Aquinas then on this. Wow, interesting. Cool.
So here, I got myself in a lot of trouble. I think I agree with how Martin Ronheimer talks about this one. Okay. Father Martin Ronheimer, yeah.
If you get a chance, listen to the debate I hosted on my channel between Father Gregory Pine and Janet Smith. So were you on the Smith, you on her side?
Yes, I'm probably closer to Janet Smith, yeah.
People should check that out. That was the greatest debate that's ever taken place on this channel, and it doesn't get enough credit. It was incredible.
Okay, yeah, I saw it on there because I thought I've got to watch that because I'll be curious. And then I have this fear of being always viewed like, askance by the Thomist establishment. So it's like me keeping away. I don't want Father Pine. I don't want to know that Father Pine would hate me if he knew me. Yeah. But now that I've outed myself, I can feel comfortable saying that.
Okay. So hey, I want to ask you before we get to these questions, give us and let's try to do this quickly.
Yep.
Give me several virtues that we don't even know anymore. We don't even use the terms anymore, and how that sort of reflects on modern society. Uxorious would be one, but you use some others.
Yeah,
chastity is obviously one.
Oh, yeah, sorry, you're that level. Yeah, chastity.
Yeah,
I mean,
think of the belt.
So think about if you're like making just a natural law argument for chastity, right? It's like there are certain sexual things that are just inappropriate at certain times. Like everyone should be able to agree with that. Yeah. And yet there's just our culture is so deeply like there's no real rule to our chastity. You don't know me, you don't know my circumstances. But it's like, can't you see that the person who just is consumed by like not measuring their sexuality is living a subhuman life, but boy, our culture just doesn't want to go there.
Here's why I think that's the case, and it has to do with the understanding of freedom as freedom from constraint and freedom for perfection.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that the things our society becomes very upset about, and rightly so, are whenever one person infringes upon the another person in the sense of constraining them.
Yes.
But as soon as you begin talking about a freedom for something, as soon as you begin talking about the teleology of moral acts, they don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, they don't,
so
but they live differently.
If you want to talk about sexual morality, then rape imposes negatively upon another person's freedom.
Yeah, exactly.
So the only things that should be considered immoral in the sexual realm are those that infringe upon someone else's
freedom. Yeah, exactly. And so you don't it's basically what that is like all there is justice. But it's a very thin justice that's only about not imposing upon the freedom of others.
Right.
Whereas, you could do the same thing as regards you drink, right? Sobriety is called a virtue, not sobriety in the sense of not drinking at all. We're just not day drinkers here at Pints for Aquinas, so hence we don't have the pint out
we
right now.
We can get one still. You just say the word. Neil will go and get it.
No, because you apparently don't. I'm not going to be the only one here. I'm not going to be the Slav who comes on is the only one. But okay, so sobriety. But once again, we all have the idea of a guy who does have it in my family. It's like, listen, whatever caused my mother to be like that was like there was potentially a moral failing there, right? We would think about, courage includes, let's say, patience, right? Like, patience is a virtue. No, but it really is. It really is. It's being able to suffer small things in a way that doesn't cause you to overreact. I mean, I'm a choleric temperament. Like, I need to inculcate
I want to go through some of these quickly. So we have chastity. What's another kind of virtue that sort of we don't use anymore, and what does that say about our society?
And I don't do the social critique enough. So I don't know what you're trying to
What about
fish for.
Well, I mean, just any virtue that has gone out of vogue, like meekness. When's the last time you heard about meekness
Yeah.
in a modern comedy or something?
Yeah, I guess. I'm so like I hope in the goodness of people a little bit more. Do we really understand liberality as a
what is liberality?
This kind of generosity that should be like our lives.
Why use liberality instead of generosity?
I'm sorry, because I'm an Aristotelian. Because it's
how do you distinguish the two?
They're the same.
Okay,
they're the same for our purposes, at least. Yeah, it's the Aristotelian in me. So I go skiing, and it's like I don't want to judge any of my co-skiers, but it's like it is a world of people who strut about in expensive clothes and in space expensive skis, etc.
So you can be immodest in 30-degree
modesty
temperature.
is a good. So it's double sense. So how often do we talk about modesty there? So we tend to think of modesty like I went over to St. Peter's. They have their little sign, cover your L, no shorts and cover your shoulders. That's what everyone thinks. But if I came dressed like this to
a soup kitchen,
to a soup kitchen, or even if I came dressed like this to like the house, unless I was passing through town or whatever, but all things equal, to the woman I dedicated the book to, very down to earth, salt of the earth woman, you just don't want to make someone uncomfortable. It's not really the mark of like, you're genteel, that you know how to make people feel good. It's a mark of morality, that you know how to use dress in a way that is appropriate. And flip side, that drives me crazy about my fellow professors. They made me cut this out of the book, actually, because they said you don't want to be, it seems too much like a professor complaining about his fellow professors, and who cares about that among our general readership? But like professors are slobs so often. Like that's unbefitting to it's unbefitting to your office of communicating truth to the next generation. Like when you're teaching, at least like try to have something that's fitting. I get it. I work partially for the church, and academia is about as bad. You're not getting paid a ton, but like try to find a way to get to just on occasion dressed to match your
and this
your
is something I think
life.
Everybody can basically understand. Yesterday I was learning about the sanctions that Biden has put on Russia, and they interviewed different generals talking about the war, the invasion of Ukraine, and I thought to myself, if this old fellow here was wearing like a bass fishing t-shirt or something, I wouldn't take him seriously at all. Yeah. And I'd be right to, because there's a sense in which as you're dressed should befit what you're trying to do.
And that's what modesty is. And there's lots of ways to be
Same thing with a doctor.
modest.
I mean, imagine if you're getting a heart transplant and you go in and the guy doesn't know how to button his shirt correctly.
Correct.
You're like, I need another doctor.
Or vice versa. I remember my wife's former OB, he'd always just wear a polo shirt because he knew that his clientele would, it would make them uncomfortable because we live in a very poor county, So whereas, the thing I had to fight against was what I got at Catholic U. Philosophy was by far the most conservative, even more than the theologians at CU, like the students at CUA, although that's been changing, right? But the culture has been very conservative for a long time. So all the graduate students always have their ties and bow ties on, and you have to get to a place where you're not sort of playing the professor like that all the time too. That's all modesty. And that's also going to fall under all the strutting and preening of the people on the slopes. So you back me into that guy instead of like what I was thinking of is the immense amount of money that gets spent. Right, I'm fine with recreation, eutropalia. The good recreation is actually another virtue. How often do we talk about playfulness? Now you got me going. Okay, here.
Just 1 second. I'm going to change subjects real quickly, and then I want you to do this.
Okay, sorry.
There is a car alarm going off. Whenever I hear a car alarm, I get incredibly anxious. Who the hell would know what their car alarm sounds like? It could be your car. It could be my car. Do you have a car alarm?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. See, what am I to do now? Now it's in my head that my car alarm is going off, and how would I know anyway? Listen.
Maybe that's someone breaking into my car. It's like my laptop bag is there, so
as
at
a
least that's all
revolt
there.
Against modern vehicles and their stupid bells and whistles, I'm going to let it keep going. It might be mine. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
And here's the other thing: whenever you've heard a car alarm, you've never thought someone's car's getting broken into.
No, truthfully, I'm
Never.
like, man, well,
that's annoying. Figure it out. Press that button.
Yeah.
All right. Eutropalia. Between
good
boorishness and
if it was, it's a.
This
opposition.
is what Aquinas talks about. Doesn't it?
But it's to have
it's the mean between the extreme of boorishness and not super.
No. I mean, it would be. I don't even know.
They turn their car alarm off.
So part of the problem here is, when teaching in a Greek seminary, if I teach this stuff, I usually don't use the Thomist vocabulary because you don't want them to know that you're using it, right? But no, eutrapelia is also but good recreation as well.
Yeah.
It's not merely just the it's like boorishness in the sense that you don't know how to like relax in a way that's appropriate. But I would just say the excess. Let's describe the excesses, whatever we want to apply to them. You can be far too flippant and be obsessed with sets of sports and things. Let's even as a skier. So not even so much because people who are watching sports aren't really doing anything sports-wise. It's just their enjoyment is the wasted time of watching games. But I can become so obsessed with skiing. This could happen. I said to my wife, if I weren't married, I had forgotten until I moved back how much I could have been a ski bum. I could obsess over it to the point that I'm putting at risk my marriage. Yeah. Putting at risk my prayer life. Just putting at risk being a normal adult because I'm just spending every day on the slopes outside of work or whatever. And that's just bad. Like, even if I'm not, contemporary people want to say, listen, as long as you're not hurting someone, as long as it's not hurting your work, exactly. Yeah. It's who are you hurting? No, you're living in a way that's less than human. I mean, this is a good kind of natural law way to talk about it. As opposed to, the other side, someone who doesn't know how to take recreation. So when my stepfather was dying, all the COVID stuff, I could only see him very limited hours, and you couldn't get in otherwise. And it was right in the middle of while we were having a lot of housework done as well, like jacking up of sections of our house for all these termite damage. And so I had the carpenters in the day and that stuff as well. And so my wife was away. So I had evenings to myself, and you're just living in my father is in a state. I mean, he was not well enough to even take phone calls or anything. So my father is just alone. And of course, you want to, yes, be prayerful, etc. But we're human. And it would have been a real failure probably because it would have, had downstream effects if I hadn't found a way to blow off some of that stress. So I spent the evenings, could go to the slopes even if it would just be for 2 hours. It's a kind of like virtuous use of recreation to keep your psyche together. And also, too, just because sometimes it's the way to relate to other people. Like, you should have not just a kind of, I don't like sports, because sometimes that's the only thing that can start a relationship with other people. It's the only thing you can relate to. And I'm not thinking of anything explicit here, but like to your in-laws or something is only through that. Okay. But generosity, one other example there, because we didn't even get to rail against what I was going to say there. Right. There's also those who will spend immense amounts on their pleasures, like, be it skiing or anything else, that don't see that, at a certain point, you need to stop getting things because you really do owe it just in strict justice to your community to be generous. You don't need a bigger house. There's a lot of room. Some people, cars, whatever. But you better have discerned. I would love as a retired man, maybe, when I don't have to worry about the kids and having dad vehicles, to own a nice Mercedes sedan. I think it probably, in my case, would be probably sinful. It would not be right. It'd be wrong because of the community I live in. It'd be a waste of my finances because then you're going to have to make the payment
and not think of your children being in there. You presumably might be uptight around your children being in your beautiful car.
Yeah, exactly.
Snapping at them.
And then also too, I'm saying after I'm retired. My grandchildren.
Right. No, but you were saying now it would be sinful, and that's one of the reasons.
Oh, now, but even later, I'm saying it would be because it would also be, it would strap. I'm a professor. It would strap the finances in a way that then I couldn't just be spontaneously generous to people, right? Yeah. Like whatever it is, you have to discern what this looks like. So hence, I'm not coming up with universal prescriptions, but at a certain point, you actually are being unjust by not seeing that ultimately, what you have is so that you can come back to the theological virtues. Ultimately, that should be the soul of all these acts. You can be as generous as God. That doesn't mean that you have to live, without any thought for the future and whatnot. But you should be able to, as your circumstances permit, have a kind of generosity. It can be as simple as like the poor old, members of like my parish who just, they make the baked goods for the sales, right? That's a kind of generosity of time. Slavs, the pierogies. I'm sure you've had pierogies, of course, right? There's a sense in which pierogies, which many people and your listeners may not know of, which are just noodles filled with cheese and potatoes with then butter and onions on top of it. Great example of like all we have is our work. We have nothing else, right? But our work has gone into this. So whatever your liberality looks like, it's actually unjust to be so caught up in your own pleasures that you you don't even think about how you should be generous to others. Like, imagine if you're a good skier and you're like, you never think that like someone you know's kid could use some lesson. That's a sin against liberality.
Let me just kind of end on this.
I'm sorry,
end on this one, and then we'll kind of move on. And I want to.
This is my progressive.
But it is a commentary on modern society as you examine each of these as to where we are. Like, I mean, the fact that no one talks of vanity so much anymore, or why boob jobs are acceptable, which is clearly not an acceptable thing, all things being equal, reduction surgery and things for health risks and things. But I mean, this is atrocious. And the idea that we wink and nod at it as if this is good. You are just trying to be the best version,
it
yada,
could be
yada.
the same thing like, Botox treatments for people who are relatively young.
Or like butt implants. I didn't know they were a thing until I was in Miami last week and my wife told me about them. And then I was like, honey, you realize now I'm just looking at everyone's butt. I'm like, is that a butt implant? Do you think? She's like, no, I don't think that's a butt implant.
At least it happened that way, and it wasn't like you were looking at them and your wife said to you, those are just implants.
Oh,
so at least you were being virtuous, and it just happened that your wife told you. So,
well, maybe we can spend an hour examining that later, just in case. But hey, I want to begin to wrap up because I want to do a whole nother video for our supporters.
Sure.
But before we do, tell us where people can learn about you. We've referenced your book several times, which is an excellent book.
So you can purchase the book at ascensionpress.com /Catholic Morality. Made by God, made for God. You can find more information on my texts.
You can just flip it out,
in general at also.
They can't be not happy with this. Come on, this is great.
I think they did a great job. I know
they really did do a good job.
Bright and although it's kind of Jesuit. Like, right, it looks like the Jesuit seal a little bit, which is like,
it could look like a Dominican with his
that's the black
cape.
Yeah, I think it's true. And that's how we should look at it. So you could go to ascensionpress.com /Catholic Morality, and then for kind of a general overview of other books, I just can't remember if it's /books, but philosophicalcatholic.com. If you go in there to the profile, philosophicalcatholic.com, the profile has then on the right side books. It also has lots of my academic stuff. You may get scared away by those things, but the various translations and things that I've done are there as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being on the show.
This was great.
Yeah, it was real fun.
Yeah.
I appreciate it very much. We're going to go over and do another recording now for our supporters on Locals or Patreon. You can go to pintswithaquinas.com /give to support there, and you'll get all of this extra content.
And you'll become beautiful.
And immediately we'll have the look of somebody with appropriate butt implants. All right, see you later, guys. God bless you.
Thank you.